Before we begin, I want you to prepare yourself, because the story you're about to hear is not comfortable. It is not simple. And it is not the kind of story history textbooks like to tell. My name is Herbert Hoover, and I am one of the most conflicted figures ever to sit in the Oval Office. That I was celebrated as a hero long before I ever stepped into politics. Millions of lives were saved because of the relief missions I organized across Europe. Families who had lost everything called me their protector, and world leaders sought my advice as if I could solve any crisis placed before me. But the moment I became President of the United States, the world's applause vanished, replaced by blame, anger, and the crushing weight of a nation collapsing into chaos. That I lived through something few people can imagine. The transformation from idolized humanitarian to the face of a national disaster. People once saw me as the man who answered every impossible challenge. Later, they saw me as the man who couldn't stop the storm. They remembered the hunger, the suffering, the fear, but they forgot the years I spent fighting for strangers across oceans. They remembered the unemployment lines, the failing banks, the despair, but they forgot the nights I spent searching for solutions no one believed in, solutions that the world would only understand decades later. This is the contradiction of my life: to be both savior and scapegoat, both admired and condemned, both the rescuer of nations and the symbol of America's darkest hour. Today, I will tell you my story the only way it should be told, not as a headline, not as a verdict, but as a man who lived every second of it. I will show you how I rose from an orphaned child in a small mining town to a world-famous engineer who solved problems others feared to touch. I will show you how I tried to shield millions from starvation and war. That I will show you the moment I stepped into the White House, where the weight of history crashed down with the fury of a collapsing world. And I will show you how even the strongest reputation can be shattered by a storm that no one, not even a president, was prepared to control. If you think you already know who Herbert Hoover was, I invite you to listen again, because the truth is far more complicated, far more human, and far more tragic than the story most people believe. Now, let us begin. People often ask me where a life truly begins. Is it at the moment of birth? Or is it the day you realize you must face the world on your own? For me, the real beginning of my life was not the moment I entered this world. It was the day I understood that my future would depend on no one but myself. That I was born in a small mining community in Iowa, quiet, modest, and a little rough around the edges. My family did not have much, but the warmth of my parents made our home feel whole. My father, a blacksmith, taught me responsibility and hard work. My mother, gentle and patient, taught me kindness and faith. These lessons would become the foundation that held me together through the storms that lay ahead. But happiness is fragile. It does not always last long. Before I had time to fully understand what a family truly meant, I lost both of my parents. The emptiness was overwhelming. Like a piece of my world had vanished overnight. That I remember the sky being overcast the day my mother passed away. Even now, it feels as though the clouds were mirroring the weight in my heart. I was not yet 10 years old, and life had already delivered its first harsh blow. That I was sent to Oregon to live with my uncle's family. The journey felt endless. That I sat quietly in the wagon, staring at the long, unbroken road ahead of me, knowing only one thing: from this moment forward, my life would be in my own hands. My uncle treated me kindly, but I never forgot that I was a child living in someone else's house. That I learned early not to cause trouble, not to ask for too much, and not to rely on anyone more than necessary. That I took on whatever work I could find, carrying supplies, cleaning, helping with chores. That a meal or a small payment was more than enough. Loneliness became my earliest, most honest teacher. It taught me that no one was coming to rescue me, and that if I wanted a future, I would have to build it myself. Life in the American West was not easy, but it shaped me. It taught me resilience. It taught me to endure, and it introduced me to the world of mining: dark tunnels, lanterns swaying in the air, heavy machinery, and men who worked with grit and determination. Something about that world fascinated me. It was a place where human effort met the raw power of nature. A place where knowledge could turn danger into progress. That I wanted to learn. That I wanted to gain the knowledge that could change my destiny. But I had no money and no support. I made a decision most would have called foolish. I applied to Stanford University. People laughed at the idea that I had no connections, no financial means, and no background that would impress anyone. But I had one thing: determination. That I wrote letters, prepared applications, asked for recommendations, and even spoke directly with professors, explaining why I believed I deserved a chance. That I did not beg for sympathy, that I simply told them the truth. I am willing to work harder than anyone else for the opportunity to learn. Maybe my sincerity mattered to someone. Maybe fate decided to open one small door for a young boy with nothing to lose. Whatever the reason, I was accepted. The first time I stepped onto Stanford's campus, it felt unreal. For the first time in my life, I stood at a beginning that was truly my own. But entering Stanford was not the end of my struggle. It was the beginning of another. That I still had no money. Every day, I needed to work to support myself. That I carried supplies, cleaned rooms, served meals, helped with experiments, anything that allowed me to earn a few dollars. But I was not ashamed. Those jobs did not diminish me. Instead, they strengthened me. They reminded me that every step forward was something I had earned. In the engineering school, I found a passion that lit something deep within me. The joy of solving real problems with knowledge and precision. Every design I drafted, every calculation I completed, every structure I studied, it all gave me a sense of purpose I had never felt. Before that, I realized then that some people are born into opportunity, while others must carve their way out of darkness to find their own light. After graduation, I became a young mining engineer. That I didn't yet know that this path would lead me across oceans, that it would make me one of the most sought-after engineers of my time, or that it would eventually pull me into the world of politics and the White House. All I knew then was this: I was no longer the boy tossed helplessly by fate. That I was a man, determined to shape his own life. And soon, my journey would accelerate, faster and farther than I ever imagined. Graduating from Stanford was only the first step. The real test lay beyond the campus gates, in a world far bigger, far harsher than anything I had ever faced. That I stepped into the mining industry as a young engineer, eager yet inexperienced at IT. First, it was overwhelming. The sheer scale of operations, the uncertainty of each venture, the lives that depended on every decision. That in Australia, I found my first true challenge: a mine plagued by mismanagement, unsafe conditions, and financial instability. The foreman doubted me. The workers doubted me. And at times, I doubted myself. But I had a method. I studied every blueprint, every report, every ledger. I walked the tunnels, inspected the machinery, and listened to the men who worked there. I did not act on assumptions. I acted on knowledge, evidence, and reason. Slowly, the operation stabilized, productivity rose, and safety improved. I learned that leadership is not about barking orders. It is about understanding problems better than anyone else and guiding people toward solutions. I traveled extensively, from the Australian outback to remote areas of China. Every new site brought its own challenges: unfamiliar terrain, unfamiliar languages, unfamiliar customs. Yet the lessons were the same. Meticulous planning, human empathy, and relentless perseverance can overcome almost any obstacle. IT was during these early years that I began to develop what would later become my hallmark: an insistence on efficiency, precision, and accountability, combined with a commitment to humanitarian values. That I was not just building mines. I was building trust, communities, and hope. I also began to realize something profound: my efforts could have a global impact. When disaster struck, famine, conflict, or natural catastrophe, I could organize resources, logistics, and expertise to save lives on a massive scale. I had glimpsed the power of human ingenuity applied with discipline and heart. And yet, I never lost sight of the simple truths I had learned as a boy: that no amount of skill or opportunity could replace hard work, personal responsibility, and integrity. I carried these lessons with me across oceans, across continents, and eventually into the corridors of power. By the time I had established my reputation as a capable, reliable engineer, I was already being noticed by international leaders. My work had taken me into situations where ordinary men would have failed. I had learned to solve problems that others deemed impossible. And I had begun to see that the world often measures people not by their accomplishments, but by the crises they face and how they respond. Little did I know then that these formative years, the orphaned boy, the struggling student, the young engineer navigating a world far larger than himself, would shape every choice I made as a man, as a humanitarian, and later, as President of the United States. The boy who had once stared out from a wagon at an endless road, uncertain of his future, had begun to understand something essential. Life would throw challenges at him far beyond what he imagined, and if he wanted to survive and someday make a difference, he would have to meet them with every ounce of his skill, discipline, and courage. And so my journey continued, with the lessons of hardship, study, and human empathy guiding me forward. The first chapter of my life, one defined by loss and determination, had laid the foundation for everything that was to come. Little did I know, the world would soon present challenges far greater than any project, or any relief effort I had yet faced. Challenges that would test not just my skill, but my very principles, and ultimately, my place in history. After graduating from Stanford and gaining some experience in the American mining industry, my journey truly expanded beyond borders that I did not know it then, but the work I was about to undertake would take me across oceans, into the remotest corners of the world, and confront challenges unlike anything I had faced before. My first overseas assignment took me to Australia. The vastness of the outback was humbling. Endless red earth stretching beneath an unforgiving sun that I was tasked with managing. Mines that were struggling under poor leadership, harsh conditions, and financial uncertainty. The foremen and workers were skeptical. They had seen engineers come and go, promising changes that never materialized. That I had nothing but determination and a methodical approach. That I learned quickly that leadership is not given. It must be earned. That I walked the tunnels daily, spoke with miners about their needs and fears, inspected every piece of machinery, studied every ledger. Gradually, the mines became more productive. Safety improved. Workers began to trust me. That it was in these tunnels that I realized the importance of human empathy, paired with knowledge and discipline. People will follow a leader who understands both the technical challenges and the human cost of failure. From Australia, I was sent to China, where I managed tin and coal operations in regions few foreigners had ever seen. The language was unfamiliar, the culture different, and the political climate complex. Yet every challenge taught me something essential. Adaptability, observation, and patience are as critical as skill and intelligence. Traveling through rural villages and remote mountains, I often marveled at the human spirit. Despite poverty, disease, and hardship, the local miners showed resilience and ingenuity. It was impossible not to be inspired. That I began to see the potential for engineering and organization to improve lives, not just profits. That I also faced disasters. Floods, landslides, and fires tested both the mines and the people who worked there. That I learned the importance of rapid decision-making, careful planning, and clear communication. Lives depended on every choice I made. That it was a responsibility I did not take lightly. In these years, my reputation as a reliable and effective engineer grew. That I was entrusted with increasingly complex operations, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, in countries as diverse as Australia, China, and Siberia. Each new challenge strengthened my skills and sharpened my judgment. That I became more than an engineer. I became a problem solver, a negotiator, and a manager of human effort. That it was during this time that I first engaged in organized humanitarian work. The 1913 to 1914 famine in China caught my attention. As an engineer with contacts and resources, I saw an opportunity to help. I coordinated with local officials, arranged transport, and supervised the distribution of food and medical supplies. The work was exhausting, but I felt a profound sense of purpose. That I realized that organization and planning could save lives on a scale far larger than I had imagined. This period taught me lessons I would carry for life. That skill without empathy is limited, that wealth without action is meaningless, and that the real measure of success lies in the impact we have on others. By 1914, Europe was at war, and the world seemed more fragile than ever. I continued my mining work, but became increasingly involved in relief efforts, helping refugees and war victims. The logistical skills I had honed managing mines were suddenly applicable to feeding and sheltering thousands of displaced people. I traveled constantly, crossing continents and oceans. I dealt with governments, private companies, and communities, learning to navigate both diplomacy and bureaucracy. Every project tested my endurance, intellect, and patience. I realized that my work could affect not only individual lives but the broader course of nations. Looking back, I can see how these years forged the foundation of everything I would later attempt. I was no longer just a miner, an engineer, or a student of the world. I was becoming a man capable of managing complex systems, leading people under extreme conditions, and confronting crises that demanded both skill and humanity. The mines, the disasters, the famine relief, the negotiations with officials, all of it prepared me for challenges far beyond anything I could have imagined. That IT was a world that demanded not just technical ability but vision, courage, and moral clarity. That I began to understand the weight of responsibility and the profound effect one person's actions could have when paired with organization and determination. That I remember one night in China, after a long day coordinating relief for famine victims, sitting on the bank of a small river. The water reflected the stars, and I thought of my childhood in Iowa, of the orphan boy traveling in a wagon, and the distant mines of Australia. I realized how far I had come, yet I also understood that this was only the beginning. The world was vast, full of need, and full of opportunity. I had been given skills, knowledge, and experience, and it was my duty to use them. These years, spent in mines, in foreign lands, and amid human suffering, taught me that true leadership is not about titles or prestige. That IT is about the ability to act decisively, compassionately, and effectively in moments of uncertainty and crisis. By the time I returned to the United States in 1915, I had not only established a reputation as one of the world's most capable engineers, but I had also discovered my calling to combine technical skill with humanitarian action. This calling would define the next chapter of my life. IT was a path that would eventually bring me into politics, into public service, and ultimately into the highest office in the land. But even as I stood at the threshold of new opportunities, I never forgot the lessons learned in Australia, China, and the many remote corners of the earth. That preparation, diligence, empathy, and courage are the keys to transforming challenge into achievement, and that even the smallest actions can change lives in ways we cannot yet see. I knew then that the world was a place of both immense suffering and immense potential, and I resolved to dedicate my life to confronting the suffering with whatever means I could muster, to harness the potential with discipline, and to act with integrity, always remembering that leadership is a responsibility, not a privilege. When the Great War erupted in Europe in 1914, the world was thrown into chaos. Nations I had only studied from afar were now consumed by destruction, and the human cost was staggering. I knew that, as an engineer and organizer, I could contribute something more than observation. I took on a new mission to organize relief for those trapped in famine, disease, and displacement caused by the war. IT was a challenge unlike any I had faced before. Entire cities were cut off from supplies. Millions of people were in desperate need. I had to plan logistics on a scale far larger than any mine I had ever managed. I coordinated with governments, international agencies, and private donors. Every decision carried consequences. Missteps could cost lives. The weight of responsibility was immense, but it clarified my purpose. Leadership meant not just giving orders, but ensuring that every plan could be executed with precision and humanity. In Belgium and northern France, I witnessed suffering on an unimaginable scale. Civilians starved while armies clashed around them. I traveled through ruined towns and villages, delivering food, medicine, and hope. The gratitude of those I helped was profound, yet it was tempered by the constant awareness that the war continued to destroy lives beyond my reach. I organized massive shipments of grain from America to war-torn regions. Each shipment required careful planning, securing transportation, navigating political obstacles, and coordinating distribution networks. IT was a test of endurance, patience, and ingenuity. Every successful delivery saved lives, and every failure reminded me of the stakes. The work required diplomacy as much as logistics. I negotiated with military authorities, local governments, and even enemy representatives when necessary. I learned that communication, transparency, and fairness could open doors that force and authority could not. These skills would later prove invaluable in both public service and politics. By 1917, the scale of the war's devastation demanded more organized and comprehensive relief efforts. I was appointed to oversee food relief across occupied and neutral territories. My team coordinated distribution, monitored supply chains, and ensured that aid reached those in greatest need. Every day was a struggle against chaos, bureaucracy, and human suffering. In Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, We fed millions that I remember the faces of starving children, the elderly too weak to work, the families who had lost everything. Their suffering became a call to action, a reminder that no amount of skill or wealth mattered unless it was used to help others. That I encountered immense resistance. War breeds suspicion, and aid workers are often seen as spies or profiteers. That I had to build trust repeatedly, proving my intentions with results, not words. Patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to humanity were essential. Through these experiences, I came to understand the full impact of organization, efficiency, and leadership. It was not enough to have knowledge. One had to apply it strategically. With empathy and foresight, that I learned that even in the midst of chaos, well-coordinated action could save millions of lives. The war relief work was exhausting, both physically and mentally. Yet it solidified my belief in the power of human effort combined with careful planning. But it reinforced a simple principle I had carried from my earliest days. When knowledge, organization, and compassion converge, extraordinary results are possible. By the end of the war, I had coordinated relief efforts that touched millions of lives. That I had seen firsthand the suffering of entire nations and understood the fragility of civilization. And I realized that public service, when executed with competence and conscience, could be a force for profound good. This chapter of my life, the war, the famine relief, the countless logistical challenges, prepared me for a role far beyond engineering. It showed me that leadership is measured not by authority or title, but by the lives one can positively influence. It instilled in me a lifelong commitment to apply knowledge and organization to alleviate suffering wherever it is found. Looking back, I see that these experiences defined me, not as a man of wealth or fame, but as a man of action, responsibility, and compassion. The world had revealed both its suffering and its potential, and I had been entrusted to bridge the gap. This path would eventually carry me to national leadership, but the lessons of Europe would remain with me always. When the guns fell silent in 1918, Europe was a continent transformed, devastated by war, starving, and in desperate need of rebuilding. I had already spent years coordinating food relief during the conflict, but the end of fighting did not mean the suffering ended. Millions remained displaced, infrastructure lay in ruins, and governments were struggling to restore order. That I was determined to continue the work. That I accepted the challenge of organizing relief on an even greater scale, this time under the auspices of international organizations. My experience managing mines and wartime logistics had taught me that meticulous planning, clear communication, and relentless perseverance were critical. But now, those lessons were being applied to feed entire nations, rebuild communities, and prevent a secondary disaster of famine and disease. That I traveled extensively across Belgium, France, Austria, Hungary, and beyond. Every country presented a unique set of challenges: corrupt officials, collapsed transportation networks, and people whose trust had been eroded by years of suffering. That I quickly realized that logistics alone would not solve the problem. That I had to engage diplomatically, coordinate between governments, and persuade reluctant donors that immediate action was essential. In 1919, I assumed responsibility for coordinating the American Relief Administration's operations in Europe. That we distributed millions of tons of food and supplies to countries devastated by war. That I supervised thousands of employees, from drivers and warehouse managers to local volunteers, all working together to ensure that aid reached those most in need. It was an enormous administrative challenge, requiring patience, attention to detail, and a deep understanding of human nature. The work was often dangerous. In some regions, political instability and social unrest made distribution difficult. In others, transportation bottlenecks or outbreaks of disease threatened entire relief programs. Each day demanded rapid problem-solving, flexibility, and the courage to make decisions under uncertainty. Through it all, I witnessed the resilience of the human spirit. Families who had lost everything found hope in the arrival of food and medicine. Children too weak to attend school slowly regained strength. Communities began to rebuild, brick by brick, thanks to coordinated efforts and consistent aid. These moments reinforced my belief that leadership is most powerful when it serves humanity directly. My work in post-war relief also brought me into contact with political leaders, diplomats, and influential figures across Europe and the United States. They observed the efficiency and scale of the programs I managed, and some began to suggest that I had skills that could serve my country more broadly. It was during this period that I realized the line between humanitarian service and public service was becoming blurred. If organization, planning, and effective execution could save millions abroad, perhaps the same principles could improve life at home. I also began advocating for broader cooperation between nations to prevent future crises. I spoke at conferences, wrote reports, and advised policymakers on strategies to coordinate relief and stabilize economies in post-war Europe. I learned that ideas could be as impactful as supplies. That vision and persuasion were tools as valuable as logistics and administration. By 1920, I had become a public figure, known both for my technical expertise and my humanitarian accomplishments. I was offered opportunities to enter formal politics, yet I remained cautious. I understood the difference between temporary fame and lasting influence. I wanted a platform where I could implement systemic solutions, not simply manage temporary relief. Nonetheless, the transition to politics was inevitable, and my work had connected me with civic leaders, influential citizens, and those who recognized the need for disciplined, organized, and ethical leadership in government. I had witnessed the consequences of inefficiency and inaction in wartime, and I was determined that, if given the opportunity, I could help prevent similar failures in national administration. The lessons I carried from post-war Europe were clear. Leadership requires vision, courage, and integrity. It demands not just the ability to manage resources, but the insight to understand the needs of people and the political will to implement solutions. It requires both decisiveness and compassion, the balance of intellect and empathy. As I returned to the United States, I was aware of the tremendous potential before me. The country itself faced challenges: economic instability, social change, and the lingering effects of global conflict. Yet the opportunity to apply the principles I had honed overseas was thrilling. I knew that public service could be a vehicle not only for efficiency, but for morality, a chance to transform hardship into progress. In the coming years, I would step into roles of increasing responsibility. I would navigate political campaigns, influence public policy, and ultimately ascend to national office. But I carried with me the enduring truths learned in the aftermath of war: that human suffering demands action, that organization and planning save lives, and that leadership is measured by the difference one makes in the lives of others. Europe had taught me about despair and hope, destruction and reconstruction, chaos and order. It had tested every skill I possessed, every ounce of patience and ingenuity. And it had proven that even in the darkest times, structured action combined with moral courage could restore life and dignity. This chapter of my life marked a turning point, and no longer was I solely an engineer, a miner, or a relief organizer. I was becoming a statesman in the truest sense, a man shaped by experience, guided by principle, and motivated by the belief that public service is the highest form of leadership. I understood that my future would not be defined solely by personal ambition, but by the lives I could improve, the systems I could strengthen, and the nation I could serve. The work in Europe had given me both the confidence and the responsibility to embrace that future fully. And so, with resolve, I began the next phase of my journey, ready to face challenges on an even larger stage. The journey to the presidency is unlike any other challenge I had faced in my life. It is a test not just of skill or intellect, but of endurance, judgment, and the ability to connect with an entire nation. I had spent decades building a reputation as an engineer, a humanitarian, and an administrator. Yet the leap from public service to the highest office in the land demanded a different kind of preparation, one that combined political strategy, public perception, and personal conviction. By the early 1920s, I had become known as a man of action and integrity. My relief work in Europe had earned international recognition, and I was regarded as a problem solver of extraordinary capacity. I was invited to advise political leaders, speak at conferences, and contribute to shaping public policy. Yet despite these accomplishments, I was acutely aware that the presidency required more than competence. It required the trust of the American people. I approached the campaign with the same methodical planning that had guided my humanitarian work. Every speech, every appearance, every written statement was carefully considered. That I believed that substance mattered more than style. Yet I knew that Americans wanted to see leadership embodied in confidence and clarity. That I sought to convey that I could manage not just programs or organizations, but the nation itself. The campaign trail was grueling. That I traveled thousands of miles across states, shaking hands, listening to concerns, and observing the struggles of ordinary Americans firsthand. That I spoke to farmers whose crops had failed, to workers whose wages stagnated, to families grappling with the rapid changes of modern life. These encounters reminded me that the presidency is not an abstract office. It is a responsibility to the lives, hopes, and fears of millions. That I emphasized my belief in efficiency, organization, and practical solutions. Government, I argued, should operate as competently as a well-managed enterprise, delivering results that tangibly improve people's lives. That I drew upon my engineering background and my experience in humanitarian relief to demonstrate that I could translate planning into action on a national scale. Every policy proposal I made was rooted in this principle: careful analysis, systematic execution, and measurable impact. Despite my credentials, I faced skepticism. Some viewed my humanitarian work as distant from the everyday concerns of American voters. Others questioned whether an engineer and administrator could navigate the messy realities of politics. That I recognized these doubts as natural, yet I remained steadfast in my approach: lead with reason, demonstrate results, and appeal to the common good. The election of 1928 presented both opportunities and challenges. That I faced opponents with significant political experience and popular appeal. But I believe that Americans were ready for leadership grounded in competence, honesty, and a proven record of service. That I spoke often of my vision for prosperity, stability, and progress, emphasizing that leadership should inspire confidence without promising illusions. My speeches were not grandiose declarations, but careful explanations of policy and purpose. That I addressed economic growth, infrastructure development, and the role of government in supporting innovation and enterprise. That I discussed social concerns with sensitivity, acknowledging that prosperity must be shared and that the government had a role in providing support when circumstances demanded. That I presented myself as a man who understood both the mechanics of administration and the human realities of the nation. As the campaign progressed, I observed the changing landscape of American politics. Mass media was becoming more influential, and public perception could be shaped as much by image as by substance. Yet I resisted the temptation to rely solely on charisma or spectacle. My focus remained on competence, ethics, and a vision that could guide the country through uncertain times. Election night was a culmination of years of work, observation, and personal sacrifice. When the results were announced, I realized that the American people had entrusted me with a profound responsibility. The office of the president is unlike any other. It carries the power to shape history, but also the weight of countless expectations, crises, and decisions that affect every citizen. Upon assuming office in 1929, I quickly encountered the realities of governance. The nation was prosperous in many respects, yet underlying vulnerabilities were becoming apparent. Agriculture was struggling, industries faced cyclical pressures, and the financial system, though sophisticated, was susceptible to instability. That I understood that my presidency would be defined not by past achievements, but by my response to the challenges of the present. That I emphasized a philosophy of voluntary cooperation between business, government, and citizens. That I believed that prosperity could be encouraged by fostering enterprise, supporting innovation, and ensuring that markets operated fairly. Government intervention should be measured, efficient, and targeted to the greatest need. This approach reflected my lifelong belief that organization, planning, and moral responsibility could solve problems more effectively than arbitrary action. Early in my administration, I also focused on humanitarian initiatives at home. Relief efforts that I had once coordinated overseas were now applied domestically. Programs to support struggling farmers, provide assistance to communities affected by industrial decline, and strengthen public infrastructure were launched. That I sought to demonstrate that government could act as a competent partner in improving lives without overreaching its authority. Yet the early months were not without challenges. Economic warning signs were subtle but persistent: declining farm prices, overextended credit, and uneven industrial growth. That I called for prudence and foresight. encouraging both private and public sectors to work together to stabilize conditions that I relied on advisors and experts, valuing evidence and analysis over political expediency. It was a philosophy rooted in my experience that careful planning and measured action prevent crises before they escalate. Internationally, I sought to strengthen America's role in global stability, trade agreements, diplomatic engagement, and cooperative initiatives reflected my belief that a prosperous, stable world benefited our nation as much as others. That I drew upon my European experiences to navigate complex foreign relations, applying organizational skill and negotiation strategies honed during wartime relief. Leadership, I had learned, transcends borders. Its principles are universal. As the months progressed, I confronted the magnitude of the presidency in full. Every decision carried consequences for millions. That I learned the delicate balance between principle and pragmatism, between efficiency and compassion. That I understood that even well-intentioned actions could have unintended effects, and I committed myself to continuous assessment, adaptation, and accountability. The early period of my presidency was marked by both accomplishment and foreboding. That I implemented initiatives that reflected my core values: organization, competence, moral responsibility, and service to the public. Yet beneath the surface, structural weaknesses in the economy and society hinted at challenges that would soon test every principle I held. These formative months established a pattern that would define my leadership: plan meticulously, act decisively, and always consider both human and systemic consequences. That I embraced the presidency with the same mindset that had guided me through mines, disasters, and international relief: with diligence, integrity, and a commitment to making a measurable difference. That I recognized that the nation's well-being was inseparable from effective governance. Leadership required not just knowledge and skill, but courage, foresight, and the ability to inspire confidence through action. This understanding would guide every decision I made as the economic and social tides shifted in the years ahead. The optimism that marked the early months of my presidency was soon overshadowed by a crisis that no amount of planning could fully anticipate. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed, and with it, the confidence of a nation. Banks failed, businesses closed, and millions of Americans faced sudden and devastating losses. It was a moment that demanded immediate action. Yet the scale and speed of the economic collapse tested every principle I had learned about leadership, organization, and responsibility. That I understood that this was no ordinary downturn. The complexity of the economy meant that localized interventions would be insufficient. Millions were unemployed, families went hungry, and communities were destabilized. The human suffering was profound, and the weight of expectation rested squarely on the presidency. I felt the full responsibility of every decision, knowing that mistakes could worsen the plight of those already suffering. That my philosophy had always been rooted in voluntary cooperation and organized, efficient action. I believed that private enterprise, guided by sound policy and moral responsibility, could restore prosperity. Government had a role, yes, but it must act prudently and complement, rather than replace, private initiative. This belief shaped the policies I pursued, even as the crisis deepened beyond initial projections. That I convened business leaders, urging them to maintain employment where possible and to avoid drastic wage cuts. That I encouraged local communities, charities, and state governments to coordinate relief efforts efficiently. That I established the President's Organization for Unemployment Relief, mobilizing private resources to address immediate needs. Every initiative reflected my conviction that systematic, organized action could alleviate suffering without creating dependency. Yet I also realized that the federal government had to step in more directly than ever before. That I approved loans and funding for public works programs designed to provide employment and stimulate the economy. Infrastructure projects, roads, dams, bridges, were not only practical improvements, but also instruments of relief. That I sought to create opportunities for Americans to work with dignity, rather than rely solely on charity. The challenges were relentless. Each decision carried unintended consequences, and each action was scrutinized by the public and press. Criticism was swift, and expectations were immense. Yet I never wavered from my principles. Act methodically, base decisions on evidence, and measure outcomes carefully. Internationally, the Depression did not spare us. Global trade contracted, foreign loans faltered, and the interconnection of economies magnified domestic hardship that I worked to maintain international cooperation, promoting trade agreements and encouraging creditor nations to support global recovery, that I drew upon my experience coordinating relief in Europe to navigate the complex interplay between domestic need and international stability. The public perception of the crisis became as challenging as the crisis itself. Americans sought immediate relief and bold action, yet I believe that enduring recovery required thoughtful, long-term strategies that I communicated frequently, explaining the rationale behind policies and appealing to a shared sense of civic responsibility. I sought to balance hope with realism, urging patience while emphasizing that organized effort could mitigate suffering. Despite my efforts, the scale of the depression was overwhelming. Unemployment soared, banks failed, and social unrest grew. That I met with governors, mayors, business leaders, and relief organizations almost daily, striving to coordinate responses. That I established agencies to monitor conditions, provide assistance, and prevent famine in vulnerable regions. Every decision was a delicate balance between immediate relief and sustainable recovery. That I also faced political opposition and criticism from all sides. Some accused me of inaction, others of overreach. That I listened carefully, adapted policies where necessary, but remained committed to principles that emphasized competence, organization, and moral responsibility. That I knew that panic and hasty measures could worsen economic instability. That I relied on reasoned judgment, data, and the counsel of experts to guide each step. The winter of 1930 was particularly harsh. Families lined up at soup kitchens, shantytowns, later called Hoovervilles, sprang up across the country, and despair was visible on every street corner. I understood their anger and frustration, yet I also knew that a hasty abandonment of principles could produce short-term relief at the cost of long-term stability. That my goal was to provide immediate aid while laying the groundwork for economic recovery. I expanded federal loan programs to support agriculture, recognizing that farmers had been among the hardest hit. That I encouraged cooperative efforts between banks, states, and local communities to prevent foreclosures and bankruptcies. That I promoted infrastructure projects to create jobs, stimulate commerce, and enhance national assets. Every initiative was an attempt to apply the organizational lessons of my career to the unprecedented challenges of the Depression. Communication remained central to my leadership. That I addressed the nation through speeches and radio broadcasts, explaining policies, offering guidance, and appealing to shared responsibility. That I emphasized the value of work, the dignity of effort, and the importance of maintaining confidence even in adversity. That I believe that leadership meant guiding people not only through material assistance, but also through moral and psychological support. Yet I learned that leadership is often judged not by intent, but by results. Despite extensive programs, the economy continued to deteriorate. Criticism intensified, protests emerged, and political pressures mounted. That I reflected constantly, questioning whether alternative strategies might have been more effective, while reaffirming my commitment to structured, principled action. Internationally, the Depression highlighted the fragility of global systems. That I urged creditor nations to maintain lending, sought to prevent trade collapses, and worked with other leaders to stabilize the global economy. That it became clear that national recovery was intertwined with international cooperation, a lesson I had first learned during the relief work in Europe. Throughout this period, I was driven by the belief that government, business, and citizens must collaborate. That I maintained faith in the ingenuity and resilience of the American people. That I relied on evidence-based policies, disciplined organization, and the moral imperative to alleviate suffering wherever possible. By the end of my first term, it was clear that the Depression would define my presidency. No previous experience could fully prepare anyone for the magnitude of the economic collapse. Yet I took solace in knowing that every action, every program, and every decision was guided by principle, evidence, and a deep sense of responsibility. That I reflected often on the lessons of my earlier career. That crises demand organized response, that leadership must balance pragmatism and morality, and that the well-being of millions depends on careful, competent governance. These lessons shaped every response, every initiative, and every message I delivered to the nation. The Great Depression tested the limits of my administration, my principles, and my leadership. That it was a period of profound challenge. yet also of profound learning that I understood that decisions would be judged by history, by the effectiveness of actions, and by the lives they touched. And I resolved to continue applying the same rigor, moral commitment, and organizational skill that had defined my entire career. The years ahead would require endurance, creativity, and courage that I faced the immense responsibility of guiding a nation through despair, preserving dignity, and laying the groundwork for eventual recovery. This chapter of my presidency, marked by crisis, action, and reflection, would forever shape my understanding of leadership and public service. As my presidency entered its later years, the weight of the Great Depression pressed upon every decision, every plan, and every public statement I made that I had believed, as I always had, that organized, methodical action guided by moral responsibility could address even the most daunting challenges. Yet I quickly realized that the crisis had outpaced traditional solutions, and the public's expectations often demanded immediate results beyond what careful planning could achieve. The economy, though showing occasional signs of stability, remained fragile. Unemployment lingered at historic levels, farms struggled under low prices, and banks were under constant threat. Each morning brought news of foreclosures, failed businesses, and families in distress. That IT was a reminder that leadership is tested not in calm times, but in the harsh reality of human suffering and systemic collapse. That I continued to emphasize voluntary cooperation between government, business, and local communities. That I called on business leaders to maintain employment, offered guidance to states managing relief efforts, and encouraged local organizations to mobilize efficiently. That I established federal programs aimed at providing immediate relief while preserving dignity and work ethic, public works initiatives, loans to farmers, and targeted assistance for the most vulnerable populations. Despite these efforts, criticism was relentless. Some accused me of acting too slowly, others of adhering rigidly to principles when bold interventions seemed necessary. I understood the frustration, yet I remained convinced that hasty or uncoordinated measures risked undermining long-term recovery. Every program, every policy was designed with careful planning and structured execution, aiming to balance immediate relief with sustainable economic stability. That I also recognized that communication with the public was essential. That I spoke frequently, addressing citizens directly through radio broadcasts and public speeches, explaining the rationale behind policies and urging patience and collective effort. That I emphasized that while temporary hardships were inevitable, organized, principled action could guide the nation toward recovery. Leadership, I believed, was not about empty promises or spectacle. It was about reasoned decisions and ethical responsibility. As the winter of 1931 progressed, the human toll of the Depression became increasingly visible. Shantytowns, later dubbed Hoovervilles, appeared across cities. Soup kitchens were crowded, and social unrest began to grow. That I met with governors, relief committees, and business leaders almost daily, coordinating efforts to provide assistance and stabilize communities. That I emphasized efficiency and careful management, believing that organized relief would serve better than piecemeal charity. That I was also deeply concerned about the long-term implications of policy. While immediate relief was necessary, I wanted to ensure that programs did not create dependency or compromise the principles of self-reliance and responsibility that I held dear. Every loan, every public works project, every initiative was designed to restore both economic function and human dignity at the same time. I faced challenges on the international front. Global trade had contracted, foreign loans faltered, and nations struggled under the ripple effects of the Depression. That I sought to maintain international cooperation, promoting agreements that would stabilize markets and encourage recovery. Experience from my European relief work taught me that domestic and international stability are inseparable, and that coordinated action is essential for long-term success. Public perception remained a formidable obstacle. Despite careful explanation of policy and relentless effort, many judged my administration solely by visible outcomes rather than by planning or intent. That I understood that leadership is always measured in results, but I also knew that structured, principled action is the only path to enduring solutions. Each criticism, each protest, reinforced my understanding that the presidency is a role of immense responsibility, requiring both endurance and moral clarity. Throughout this period, I reflected constantly on the nature of governance that I learned that effective leadership demands balancing immediate relief with long-term stability, empathy with rational planning, and public expectation with principled action. Decisions could never be perfect, but they must always be guided by ethical considerations and practical insight. Despite setbacks and mounting criticism, I never wavered in my commitment to service that I coordinated federal relief programs, promoted public works to employ millions, and continued to advocate for cooperation between business, government, and citizens. Every measure was an attempt to stabilize the economy, alleviate human suffering, and maintain the integrity of governance. That I also remained mindful of the psychological and moral dimensions of leadership. Americans were facing unprecedented despair, and it was essential not only to provide material assistance, but also to foster confidence, hope, and a sense of shared responsibility. That I addressed the nation frequently, explaining that the path to recovery required both effort and patience, and that ethical, organized action could guide the country through its darkest times. Even as the years progressed, I encountered the limits of presidential power no matter the plans or programs. The sheer scale of the Depression constrained what could be achieved through government alone. That I learned firsthand that leadership is a constant negotiation between principle and pragmatism, vision and reality, short-term relief and long-term stability. Looking back on this period, I realized that the presidency is both a profound privilege and a tremendous burden. It demands constant vigilance, unwavering moral commitment, and a tireless focus on the welfare of others. Though public approval waned and criticism intensified, I remained guided by the principles that had defined my life: careful planning, ethical leadership, and an unwavering commitment to organized, effective action. This stage of my presidency, marked by crisis, public scrutiny, and relentless effort, taught me lessons that would resonate for the rest of my life. I understood the importance of preparation, the inevitability of unforeseen challenges, and the enduring necessity of principled leadership. While the nation struggled, I continued to act with integrity, competence, and the conviction that organized, moral action could guide America toward eventual recovery. That in these years, I saw the human consequences of policy decisions more vividly than ever. Families, farmers, workers, and communities depended on government action, and the responsibility of each choice weighed heavily upon me. Yet I also witnessed resilience, ingenuity, and cooperation among Americans, a testament to the potential for organized effort to overcome adversity. This period of my presidency, though fraught with difficulty, solidified my understanding of leadership under crisis. It reinforced the importance of ethical responsibility, structured action, and the balance between immediate relief and long-term stability. That I knew that the months and years ahead would continue to test every principle I held, but I approached them with the same dedication, discipline, and moral clarity that had guided my entire life. After leaving the presidency, my life entered a new phase, one in which public service continued, albeit without the visibility or authority of the White House. That I remained deeply committed to contributing wherever my experience, judgment, and principles could benefit the nation and the world. The lessons learned during the Great Depression, though harsh, became guiding principles for my later endeavors. That I devoted significant effort to humanitarian work, drawing on my early experiences in European relief after World War I. I advised governments, international organizations, and private agencies on the most effective ways to address suffering, distribute aid, and manage large-scale relief programs. That I emphasized careful planning, efficient administration, and respect for the dignity of those receiving assistance. Even outside formal political office, I believe that leadership required action, structured, ethical, and results-oriented. In addition to humanitarian work, I remained engaged in public policy and economic matters. That I offered counsel on national and international economic stabilization, advocated for trade agreements that could stimulate recovery, and advised on policies designed to prevent future crises. That I understood that my experience navigating the Depression, coordinating complex programs, and leading a nation in turmoil provided unique insights that could be valuable in both domestic and international contexts. Despite my reduced public profile, I maintained a voice in the public discourse. That I wrote articles, delivered speeches, and consulted with officials, emphasizing the importance of reasoned, ethical action, and the long-term perspective required for effective governance that I sought to demonstrate that leadership is not limited to holding office. It is expressed through guidance, example, and sustained commitment to the welfare of others. That I also spent time reflecting on the nature of leadership and the lessons learned from my presidency. The Great Depression had taught me that crises test every principle, challenge every decision, and scrutinize every action. That I recognize that public perception often overshadows intent. Yet the measure of leadership lies in integrity, consistency, and the dedication to do what is right, regardless of immediate approval or applause. Humanitarian and diplomatic efforts occupied much of my time. That I advised on refugee resettlement, international relief funding, and strategies to stabilize nations recovering from war or economic collapse. That I worked quietly but diligently, believing that the long-term impact of carefully coordinated action often surpasses short-term recognition or credit. Leadership, I realized, is as much about fostering systems and institutions as it is about individual decisions. That I reflected frequently on the principles that had guided me throughout life: organization, preparation, ethical responsibility, and the belief in voluntary cooperation as a foundation for social stability. These principles had guided my presidency, my early relief work, and my later advisory roles, and they continued to shape my understanding of effective service. That in my later years also allowed for personal reflection on legacy. That I considered both the successes and failures of my presidency, the impact of my decisions on millions of Americans, and the lessons that could be imparted to future leaders. That I understood that history would judge my actions not only in terms of immediate outcomes, but also by the principles I upheld and the enduring influence of my work. One of the most rewarding aspects of this period was mentoring and advising new generations of public servants. That I emphasized the importance of structured planning, moral clarity, and disciplined action. That I sought to instill an understanding that leadership is both a privilege and a responsibility, and that public service requires dedication, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to ethical principles. Throughout these years, I observed the nation recovering under new leadership. Programs implemented during Roosevelt's administration differed from my approach, yet I remained focused on offering guidance, analyzing policy, and emphasizing efficiency and ethical responsibility. That I recognized that the principles of effective leadership are universal, even if the methods of governance evolve with time. That I also reflected on my personal philosophy regarding adversity, public expectation, and moral responsibility. Even in moments of criticism or political defeat, I believe that consistent, principled action is the foundation of lasting impact. Leadership, I understood, is tested in times of challenge, refined through experience, and ultimately measured by the positive influence it leaves behind. That in my later years, I continued to advocate for organized, ethical approaches to national and international issues. That I wrote, spoke, and advised on economic policy, public administration, and humanitarian relief. Though no longer commanding the executive branch, I exercised influence through reasoned counsel, moral guidance, and persistent engagement with issues of enduring importance. That I came to see that my legacy would not be defined solely by the hardships of the Great Depression or political victories and defeats. That it would be defined by a lifelong commitment to service, the application of structured, principled action, and the enduring impact of ethical leadership. That I understood that the truest measure of a life in public service is the tangible difference made in the lives of others and the institutions strengthened through dedicated effort. Even as I aged, I remained engaged, offering my experience to guide policy, advise on humanitarian programs, and support initiatives that promoted stability and human welfare. That I knew that the lessons of the past, the successes, and the mistakes were invaluable for future generations of leaders. Leadership, I concluded, is about responsibility, foresight, and moral courage, not about personal recognition or short-term acclaim. That in my final reflections, I considered the arc of a life dedicated to public service, from engineering and relief work to the presidency and beyond. Each experience had shaped my understanding of leadership, ethics, and the value of disciplined, organized action. That I understood that every decision, every program, and every initiative must be guided by principle, executed with competence, and measured by its impact on human lives. That I took comfort in knowing that my life's work had been devoted to the service of others, guided by reason, moral responsibility, and unwavering dedication. Even in failure, even in criticism, the effort to act with integrity, structure, and foresight has lasting significance. Leadership is not defined solely by office, popularity, or immediate outcomes. It is defined by the enduring influence of principled action and the tangible improvement of human lives. As I reflected on decades of service, I recognized the enduring truths that had guided me. That preparation, organization, ethical responsibility, and disciplined action are essential to effective leadership. That public service is a profound duty extending beyond position or title, and that true leadership leaves a lasting imprint not in accolades, but in strengthened institutions, improved lives, and a more stable society. My later years were a testament to the enduring value of service, guided by principle, reinforced by experience, and sustained by a commitment to humanity. That I took solace in knowing that, despite the trials of my presidency, I had remained faithful to the principles that define my life and work. Leadership, I understood fully, is measured not only in successes but in the integrity, consistency, and dedication with which one approaches the responsibilities entrusted to them. As the years progressed, I became increasingly engaged in both domestic and international public service, understanding that influence does not require office, but only commitment, knowledge, and ethical action. The lessons of my presidency, though sometimes harshly judged, provided a foundation for effective advisory work and practical contribution. That I devoted much attention to the global economic situation. Governments across Europe, Asia, and the Americas sought guidance on currency, stabilization, trade agreements, and financial policy to prevent the recurrence of crises like the Great Depression. That I provided recommendations rooted in decades of experience managing complex systems, coordinating relief, and administering government programs. Every suggestion emphasized structured planning, realistic assessment, and the long-term implications of policy. That I in the United States, I continued to advise policymakers, congressional committees, and private organizations on economic and social challenges. That I urged measures that encouraged voluntary cooperation between government, business, and local communities. That I emphasized efficiency in administration, careful targeting of aid, and maintaining dignity and self-reliance among citizens receiving support. That I believe that sound policy relies not only on intentions, but on execution, oversight, and respect for the principles of responsibility and accountability. During this period, I also returned to humanitarian concerns that had long been central to my life. Millions were still affected by the economic aftershocks of the Depression, natural disasters, and social dislocation worldwide. That I worked with organizations to provide coordinated relief, drawing on prior lessons to maximize impact while minimizing waste, duplication, or dependency. That I emphasized that ethical action must be efficient, that compassion must be coupled with strategy, and that public service is most effective when guided by both heart and reason. At the same time, my public image began a slow, gradual rehabilitation. Journalists, historians, and scholars increasingly recognized that the decisions I had made during my presidency were guided by principle, organization, and moral responsibility. While criticism of the past remained, the narrative expanded to include my post-presidential contributions to global economic stability and humanitarian initiatives. That I realized that sustained, ethical engagement over time could influence both historical evaluation and contemporary perception. That I often reflected on the broader meaning of service and influence. Leadership, I believed, is exercised not only through formal authority, but through guidance, mentorship, and the application of experience to real-world challenges. That I sought to demonstrate that knowledge and principle, combined with diligent effort, could shape policy, support institutions, and improve human lives. Even in the absence of elected office, that I engaged frequently with emerging leaders, policymakers, and scholars, sharing insights drawn from decades of experience in both domestic and international arenas. That I emphasized the importance of planning, ethical responsibility, adaptability, and foresight. That I wanted to ensure that the lessons of my career, successes, failures, and everything in between would inform and guide future generations of public servants. Much of my advisory work involved international economic reconstruction. That I assisted governments in designing policies to restore stability, encourage trade agreements that promoted mutual prosperity, and helped coordinate relief for nations still struggling with the consequences of war and economic collapse, that I consistently stressed that recovery must balance immediate action with sustainable, principled planning, and that each decision carried both ethical and practical implications that at home. I also monitored economic trends, offering advice on public policy, social welfare, and infrastructure programs. I remained committed to promoting voluntary cooperation, efficiency, and the preservation of dignity in all initiatives. Even outside formal authority, I believe that my experience could help governments navigate difficult choices, avoid past mistakes, and implement programs that were both humane and effective. During this period, I observed the evolving public discourse about my presidency. While some criticism remained, an increasing number of historians, journalists, and policymakers began to recognize the constraints under which I had governed, the ethical considerations guiding my decisions, and the broader context of the Great Depression. That I understood that history is measured over decades, not months, and that continued service could shape both contemporary perception and long-term evaluation. That I also reflected deeply on personal growth, resilience, and the meaning of leadership. Challenges, I realized, refine judgment, illuminate principles, and reveal the limits and potential of influence. I sought to act in ways that reinforced my lifelong commitments: disciplined action, ethical responsibility, and the practical application of knowledge to serve others. One of the most rewarding aspects of this period was witnessing the tangible results of guidance and organized action. Programs implemented with careful planning stabilized economies, improved social welfare, and strengthened institutions. Though my involvement was often behind the scenes, the outcomes demonstrated that principled, methodical action can have lasting impact, even without public acclaim. I also invested time in writing, public speaking, and mentoring. Through these efforts, I aim to transmit both knowledge and values to a new generation of leaders. I emphasize that leadership is not merely about titles or office, but about the persistent pursuit of public good, guided by principle, organization, and moral clarity. As the years passed, my legacy gradually expanded beyond the presidency. The combination of public service, humanitarian efforts, and economic advisement painted a broader picture: a life devoted to the welfare of others, guided by ethics, competence, and responsibility. I recognize that leadership is most enduring when it strengthens institutions, empowers others, and promotes sustainable solutions. Through these engagements, I also learned that influence is measured not by immediate recognition, but by results, resilience, and the ethical consistency of action. Even in retirement from formal office, I discovered that I could continue to shape outcomes, mentor leaders, and contribute to public understanding and policy. This period reinforced an important principle: service is continuous. One does not retire from responsibility. Opportunity to contribute exists wherever skills, experience, and ethical commitment intersect with need. I found purpose in every advisory role, every humanitarian initiative, and every opportunity to counsel leaders navigating difficult decisions. In reflection, I understood that history evaluates not only office holders, but also those who persist in service after formal authority ends. The enduring measure of leadership, I realized, lies in preparation, principle, structured action, and the long-term benefits delivered to society. By applying experience ethically and effectively, one can leave a legacy of tangible impact, irrespective of political fortune. Even in these later years, I remained deeply engaged, balancing domestic and international work, humanitarian efforts, and mentorship. Each effort reaffirmed the values that had guided my life: integrity, competence, organization, and unwavering dedication to service. I understood that the true measure of a life in public service is the sum of contributions, guidance, and improvements delivered to others over time. As I moved through this stage of life, I realized that public perception is fluid, but principled action endures. Though initial judgments of my presidency had been harsh, continued commitment to service, ethical engagement, and tangible results gradually reshaped both my reputation and the historical narrative. I took satisfaction in knowing that dedication, competence, and moral responsibility could transcend office, acclaim, or temporary judgment, leaving a lasting impact on society. After the trials of the presidency and the tumult of the Great Depression, I entered a new phase of life, one defined by service without office, influence without power, and responsibility guided purely by principle. The nation had changed, yet the need for organized, ethical leadership remained as pressing as ever. I felt compelled to continue contributing. Leveraging the experience I had amassed through decades of engineering, humanitarian work, and public administration, my first focus was international economic affairs. The world was still grappling with the aftermath of the global depression, and nations sought guidance to restore trade, stabilize currency, and promote sustainable recovery. I was invited to advise governments, international organizations, and committees on practical solutions. Drawing on both my experience as president and my earlier work coordinating relief in Europe after World War I approached each task with meticulous analysis, structured recommendations, and an unwavering commitment to ethical, effective action. I believe that economic stability abroad was inseparable from domestic recovery. Global trade networks, financial institutions, and interdependent economies required careful oversight and cooperative strategies. I emphasized that recovery must be built on realistic assessments, disciplined planning, and voluntary collaboration between nations. The mistakes that had exacerbated the depression underscored the danger of rushed or ill-considered policies, and I sought to prevent repetition of these errors. At the same time, I began the slow process of restoring my own public image. The narrative of my presidency had been dominated by hardship, criticism, and public dissatisfaction. Yet history is never static, and I understood that continued service, visible results in humanitarian and economic initiatives, and principled conduct could gradually reshape public perception. I welcomed opportunities to engage with scholars, policymakers, and civic organizations, demonstrating the enduring relevance of structured, ethical leadership. One of the defining aspects of this period was my engagement with humanitarian relief on a global scale. Crises persisted in Europe and Asia, with millions displaced, nations struggling to feed their populations, and governments seeking advice on effective coordination. I drew upon my prior experience managing large-scale relief programs, emphasizing accountability, planning, and respect for human dignity. Every initiative, every recommendation, was designed to maximize impact while preserving both efficiency and ethical standards. I also participated in diplomatic efforts that required discretion, tact, and an understanding of both history and strategy. I advised on international trade agreements, loan negotiations, and recovery initiatives, always emphasizing reasoned analysis, careful coordination, and long-term stability. Although I no longer held formal authority, I discovered that influence can be exercised through competence, integrity, and dedication, principles far more enduring than any office. The challenges of this period were diverse. Nations differed in capacity, motivation, and willingness to cooperate. Policies that succeeded in one context often failed in another. I relied on data, observation, and structured problem solving, constantly adapting strategies to changing circumstances while remaining faithful to fundamental principles of organization and ethical responsibility. During these years, I observed how leadership evolves. Point 1 does not require title or power to shape outcomes. Wisdom, experience, and moral clarity can guide decisions, foster cooperation, and influence both policy and perception. I found satisfaction in seeing programs succeed, even quietly, and in knowing that effective action could ripple across borders, affecting countless lives without fanfare or recognition. I also reflected on the importance of moral responsibility in a world recovering from crisis. Economic recovery is not solely a matter of numbers. It is about human welfare, dignity, and the structures that allow societies to flourish. Every recommendation I offered, every advisory role I undertook, was filtered through a lens of ethical obligation and practical feasibility. Leadership, I realized, is enduring not because of accolades or recognition, but because of the tangible improvements it brings to the lives of others. Through these efforts, my public image began a subtle transformation. Historians, journalists, and policy experts revisited my presidency with nuance, acknowledging both the challenges I faced and the principles guiding my decisions. While criticism remained, the recognition of my post-presidential contributions to global economic stability and humanitarian relief highlighted a broader narrative, one of consistent service, moral integrity, and practical action. I also took time for reflection, considering the arc of my life and the lessons that could be imparted to future generations, that I noted that leadership under crisis requires preparation, decisiveness, and ethical grounding. That public service extends beyond office, and that resilience, principle, and competence endure far longer than popularity or acclaim. These reflections shaped how I approached each new challenge, each advisory role, and each opportunity to contribute meaningfully to the public good. The early years of this post-presidential period demonstrated the enduring value of experience. Decades of service, from engineering projects to international relief, from presidential leadership to public advisement, provided a foundation to tackle complex problems with clarity, efficiency, and principled. I understood that knowledge applied ethically and systematically can achieve far-reaching impact. Even in the absence of formal authority. As I engaged in these efforts, I also sought to mentor and guide emerging leaders. That I shared insights on organization, planning, ethical responsibility, and the importance of balancing immediate action with long-term vision. That I emphasized that leadership is a continuous commitment, not constrained to office or title, and that the ability to influence positively rests on both competence and character. That I found satisfaction in seeing programs succeed quietly, in knowing that carefully structured initiatives alleviated suffering, stabilized economies, and strengthened institutions. That it was a reminder that meaningful action does not always require public acclaim, but rather disciplined effort, moral integrity, and unwavering dedication to service. In the process of rebuilding my public image and contributing internationally, I came to a deeper understanding of legacy. That a life of service is measured not by temporary judgment or immediate approval, but by the enduring impact of principled action, the strength of institutions fortified, and the lives positively affected. Even past failures serve as lessons, informing decisions, guiding strategy, and reinforcing the necessity of preparation, integrity, and ethical responsibility. This early stage of my post-presidential life focused on diplomacy, international economic advisement, and humanitarian efforts, demonstrated that influence extends beyond office. Leadership is exercised through reasoned counsel, structured initiatives, and principled engagement with the challenges facing societies at home and abroad. That I found renewed purpose in contributing, quietly yet effectively, shaping outcomes through experience, insight, and dedication. Looking back on these years, I recognize that the measure of leadership is not power, popularity, or acclaim. It is the ability to organize, to act ethically, to plan prudently, and to influence positively the lives of others. In this period, I rediscovered the joy and responsibility of service, proving to myself that meaningful contribution transcends position, title, or temporary public opinion. As the final decades of my life unfolded, I spent much time reflecting on the arc of service, leadership, and the responsibilities that define a life devoted to public good. The presidency, with all its triumphs and tribulations, had shaped me profoundly, yet it was only one chapter in a lifetime of effort dedicated to humanity, organization, and ethical action. I came to understand that legacy is built not by popularity or immediate recognition, but by the consistency, principle, and tangible impact of one's actions. Every initiative, every program, every advisory role I undertook was grounded in preparation, careful analysis, and moral responsibility. I realized that these elements, rather than transient acclaim, determine whether one's contributions endure through history. I continued my humanitarian efforts with renewed focus. Natural disasters, economic upheavals, and social crises persisted across the globe, and I applied the lessons learned from prior relief work to new challenges. I emphasized efficient coordination, respect for those served, and solutions that balanced immediate need with long-term sustainability. These experiences reinforced my belief that ethical leadership is inseparable from practical competence and structured action. As I engaged with younger leaders and policymakers, I sought to pass on insights from decades of public service. I emphasized that leadership requires both moral clarity and pragmatism, understanding when to act decisively, when to plan meticulously, and when to adapt to changing circumstances. I shared that true influence is measured not by titles, but by the ability to guide decisions, shape institutions, and positively affect human lives. The history of my presidency, once marked by intense criticism, gradually received a more nuanced interpretation. Scholars began to recognize that the challenges I faced, the Great Depression, economic contraction, and international instability, were unprecedented in scale. They acknowledged that my actions were guided by principle, long-term strategy, and ethical responsibility, even when results were constrained by circumstances beyond my control. That I observed this reassessment with both humility and a quiet satisfaction. Understanding that history often tempers immediate judgment with perspective, that I also reflected on the broader meaning of service. Public office is but one avenue. Influence and leadership extend far beyond formal authority. Through advisory roles, humanitarian work, writing, and mentorship, I continued to apply the skills, experience, and principles cultivated over a lifetime. Each engagement, however modest, was an opportunity to contribute meaningfully, uphold ethical standards, and leave a positive mark on society. During these years, I considered the lessons of crisis, failure, and recovery. That I understood that adversity tests character, sharpens judgment, and reveals both the strengths and limits of leadership. That I learned that criticism is inevitable, but ethical, well-reasoned, and principled action endures beyond immediate perception or political fortune. These lessons, I believed, were essential for future leaders to internalize if they hoped to serve effectively in turbulent times. That I also reflected on the importance of resilience and perseverance. Life's challenges, personal, professional, and societal, demand endurance, integrity, and steadfast commitment to principle. Even when circumstances are harsh, solutions must be guided by careful planning, structured action, and moral responsibility. This philosophy remained the cornerstone of my life, both during my presidency and in the decades that followed. My post-presidential years allowed me to focus on contributions that transcended politics. That I engaged with international organizations to advise on economic recovery, trade, and humanitarian relief. That I participated in initiatives to stabilize nations recovering from war or economic collapse, always emphasizing structured, principled action. These efforts demonstrated that leadership, even without formal office, could yield significant, lasting results. That I also spent time writing and sharing reflections on leadership, governance, and public service. Through articles, memoirs, and correspondence, I communicated principles of ethical action, disciplined planning, and moral responsibility. That I sought to ensure that the experiences of my presidency, successes, challenges, and missteps alike, could serve as guidance for future generations of leaders. Even in my later years, I remained acutely aware of the broader consequences of public service. Every decision, every initiative, every piece of advice carries weight. Leadership is measured not only by immediate outcomes, but by long-term effects, the resilience of institutions, and the well-being of those affected. I believe that understanding this principle is crucial for any individual seeking to serve with integrity and effectiveness. Throughout these decades, I witnessed the slow but steady restoration of my public image. While criticism of my presidency never vanished entirely, recognition of my post-presidential service, ethical dedication, and practical contributions grew. I took satisfaction in knowing that a life devoted to principle, action, and public welfare can ultimately shape both perception and historical evaluation. That I also emphasized mentorship as an enduring form of service, sharing lessons about preparation, organization, ethical responsibility, and the balance between pragmatism and principle became as important as any policy or program I had led. That I encourage future leaders to understand that influence derives not solely from office, but from integrity, experience, and the disciplined application of knowledge for the common good. In my reflections, I considered the totality of a life dedicated to service. From engineering projects to humanitarian relief, from the presidency to advisory roles, the common thread was ethical, principled action and a commitment to structured, effective service. That I understood that history evaluates actions over decades, not months, and that true leadership leaves an enduring mark through the lives improved, institutions strengthened, and problems addressed. Even as my life drew toward its later years, I found purpose in continued engagement. Every advisory role, every initiative, every act of mentorship or counsel was an opportunity to reaffirm the principles that had guided me. Integrity, organization, ethical responsibility, and dedication to the public good. That I realized that service is a lifelong pursuit, and that influence and contribution persist long after formal office ends. Finally, I reflected on the lessons I hope to impart to future generations. Leadership requires preparation, foresight, and ethical grounding. Public service extends beyond office and title, encompassing mentorship, counsel, and practical action. Influence is measured by tangible results, long-term impact, and the strengthening of institutions. Moral responsibility and principled action endure far longer than popularity, acclaim, or temporary judgment. These decades of reflection and service, quietly yet consistently undertaken, allowed me to understand that a life devoted to public good is measured not in fame or recognition, but in the lasting, principled impact one leaves on society and the lives of others. That I found solace, purpose, and fulfillment in this understanding, confident that the lessons of my life would continue to guide leaders, citizens, and nations long after I was gone. As the world edged closer to global conflict, I remained deeply engaged in the affairs of both the United States and the international community. Though no longer in formal office, my experience and perspective were often sought by policymakers, diplomats, and civic leaders facing unprecedented challenges. The lessons of the Great Depression, combined with decades of humanitarian and economic work, gave me a foundation to provide guidance on both domestic stability and international cooperation. One of the most pressing concerns was the rise of political extremism in Europe. Governments were under strain, economies faltered, and millions of citizens faced uncertainty and hardship. That I corresponded with officials and advisors abroad, emphasizing the need for measured economic policy, cooperative trade strategies, and humanitarian planning to mitigate the worst effects of political instability. That I believe that careful preparation, foresight, and structured action could make the difference between chaos and recovery. In Washington, I maintained a respectful but candid dialogue with the Roosevelt administration. While we did not always agree on methods or policy, I offered counsel grounded in principle, experience, and historical perspective. That I stressed that economic stability, efficient administration, and ethical governance must guide any program, particularly in times of crisis. Even outside the presidency, I understood that reasoned advice and disciplined analysis could influence decisions that affected millions. During this period, I also engaged in humanitarian initiatives that intersected with emerging global crises. That I coordinated with relief organizations to provide aid to populations affected by economic disruption, natural disasters, and political unrest. That I emphasized that aid must be well organized, targeted effectively, and executed with respect for human dignity. The experience reminded me that leadership is not confined to office. It is expressed through action, oversight, and the persistent application of knowledge and principle. That I devoted significant effort to advising on economic and trade matters. International loans, currency stabilization, and cross-border commerce required careful planning and meticulous oversight. That I drew upon my presidential experience and prior international relief work to provide practical, structured recommendations. That I stressed that sustainable recovery required both cooperation among nations and rigorous attention to administrative detail. The interaction with the Roosevelt administration was delicate. That I respected the office and the leadership, yet I felt a duty to offer candid, principle-driven advice. There were moments of alignment, particularly in humanitarian efforts and international economic coordination, and moments of divergence, especially regarding domestic policy approaches. Through it all, I maintained the belief that constructive engagement and ethical guidance could influence outcomes even from outside formal power. That I also reflected on the broader responsibilities of citizenship and leadership during turbulent times. Crisis exposes both weakness and opportunity, and it demands that those with experience act not out of ambition, but out of a sense of duty. That I sought to demonstrate that decades of experience, combined with integrity and disciplined action, could help guide policy, prevent missteps, and mitigate human suffering. Humanitarian and relief work during this period often required careful navigation of political and social sensitivities. Populations affected by war preparations, economic uncertainty, and civil unrest needed coordinated support. That I worked with international agencies to plan interventions that were effective, accountable, and ethically grounded. That I believe that the credibility and moral authority of leadership is reinforced by tangible well-executed action that I also spent considerable time advising young diplomats, economists, and public administrators that I shared insights on crisis management, long-term planning, and ethical responsibility that I emphasize that experience matters, but so too does the moral framework guiding decisions. True leadership, I believed, requires a balance of analytical rigor, ethical clarity, and pragmatic execution. During these years, I observed how public perception continued to evolve. The narrative surrounding my presidency remained complex, yet my ongoing contributions to humanitarian relief, economic advisement, and mentorship gradually reshaped understanding that I realized that service, principle, and consistent action over time could restore both personal credibility and historical recognition. As the threat of global war intensified, I remained committed to promoting stability and cooperation wherever possible. Economic planning, diplomatic counsel, and humanitarian preparedness were all areas where experience could make a measurable difference. That I approached each challenge with the belief that well-considered, principle-driven action can influence outcomes, even when the forces at play seem overwhelming. That I also reflected on the enduring principles that had guided my life. Preparation and organization as the foundation for action, ethical responsibility as the compass for decision-making, discipline and foresight as tools to navigate uncertainty, commitment to human welfare as the ultimate measure of success. These principles guided both my post-presidential service and my interactions with the next generation of leaders. That I sought to instill an understanding that leadership is not defined by office or popularity, but by consistent, principled action and the ability to positively influence the lives of others. During this period, I often witnessed the interplay between policy, perception, and principle. Good intentions alone are insufficient. Structured planning, ethical grounding, and disciplined execution are essential. That I shared these lessons in my writings, correspondence, and direct mentorship, hoping to leave a lasting impact on both policy and the culture of leadership. That I also considered the broader historical context of my service. The crises of the 1930s and the emerging challenges of the late 1930s and early 1940s offered lessons on the fragility and resilience of nations, economies, and institutions. That I believe that applying experience ethically and systematically could prevent mistakes, promote stability, and enhance human welfare across borders. Even as the world moved toward war, I continued to prioritize careful analysis, humanitarian planning, and principled advisement. That I understood that in times of uncertainty, clear thinking, ethical clarity, and disciplined action are more valuable than rhetoric or expediency. Leadership, in these moments, is measured by the effectiveness and morality of guidance, not by visibility or acclaim. That my efforts during this period reinforced a central truth. Service is continuous, and influence can persist long after formal office ends. Through advisory roles, humanitarian coordination, and mentorship, I could continue to contribute meaningfully to the public good. That I found satisfaction in knowing that decades of experience, applied consistently and ethically, could help navigate the challenges facing both nations and individuals. Finally, I reflected on my evolving legacy. The presidency had been a crucible, testing every principle and decision. Post-presidential service allowed me to apply lessons learned, restore credibility, and demonstrate that leadership is measured by action, integrity, and tangible impact rather than temporary judgment or popular opinion. That I took solace in knowing that my life's work, presidential and post-presidential, would provide guidance, insight, and inspiration for generations to come. As global tensions escalated in the late 1930s, I remained closely involved in advising governments, international organizations, and civic leaders. Though I no longer held formal office, decades of experience in governance, humanitarian relief, and economic policy positioned me to provide informed counsel on matters of both domestic and international importance. The rise of totalitarian regimes and the threat of widespread conflict demanded careful, reasoned responses. That I emphasized economic stability as a critical foundation for political security, arguing that nations facing internal dislocation or financial chaos were vulnerable to extremism and instability. Through correspondence, meetings, and policy papers, I advocated for strategic cooperation among nations, practical trade agreements, and economic measures designed to reduce risk and support recovery at the same time. I closely observed the Roosevelt administration and the implementation of the New Deal that I recognized the effort to address domestic economic hardship, but I maintained a critical perspective rooted in principle, efficiency, and long-term stability that I cautioned that emergency measures, if poorly structured, could generate inefficiency, dependency, and unforeseen consequences that I urged policies that emphasized organization, accountability, and voluntary cooperation, reminding policymakers that ethical and practical considerations must guide every initiative. During this period, I also intensified humanitarian engagement. Millions continued to suffer from economic dislocation, natural disasters, and political upheaval, both in the United States and abroad. That I worked with relief agencies and international organizations to design programs that balanced urgency with effectiveness, ensuring that aid reached those most in need while maintaining dignity and self-reliance. That I believe that well-coordinated, ethically grounded interventions could alleviate suffering and stabilize societies even in the absence of political authority. That I devoted considerable attention to advising on international trade, currency stabilization, and financial recovery. The experience of the Great Depression demonstrated that economic mismanagement and protectionist policies could have cascading, destructive effects. That I emphasized policies that encouraged international cooperation, disciplined fiscal planning, and pragmatic responses to complex problems. That I frequently stressed that long-term stability requires reasoned, structured planning rather than reactive, short-term measures. My interactions with the Roosevelt administration were guided by respect, but I did not hesitate to provide candid advice. That I understood that governments benefit from diverse perspectives, and I sought to contribute experience-based guidance without overstepping my role, where alignment existed. Particularly in humanitarian and international policy initiatives, I supported coordinated action. Where disagreements arose, I offered reasoned critique, emphasizing the importance of principle, organization, and accountability. That I also reflected on the broader responsibilities of experienced leaders in times of global uncertainty. Leadership, I realized, is exercised not solely through office, but through counsel, example, and consistent application of knowledge. That I endeavored to demonstrate that ethical, principle-driven guidance can influence both policy and perception, shaping outcomes in ways that endure beyond formal authority. Humanitarian relief remained a constant focus. That I coordinated with organizations to provide aid for displaced populations, those affected by famine or economic hardship, and communities destabilized by political unrest. Each initiative was carefully structured to maximize impact while preserving dignity and minimizing dependency. That I believe that effective leadership is measured by the tangible improvement of lives, not by recognition or acclaim. During this period, I also invested time in mentoring emerging leaders, scholars, and policymakers. That I emphasized lessons drawn from decades of public service, the necessity of preparation, the value of ethical responsibility, and the importance of balancing pragmatism with principle. That I sought to instill an understanding that influence is derived not from title or office, but from competence, integrity, and disciplined action. That I witnessed the ongoing evolution of public and historical perception of my presidency. While some criticism persisted, acknowledgement of my post-presidential service, humanitarian contributions, and policy guidance gradually reshaped the narrative. I found reassurance in knowing that consistent, principled action over decades can restore credibility and provide a more nuanced historical evaluation. That I also reflected on the interaction between policy and human welfare, economic measures, administrative programs, and international cooperation all have human consequences. That I emphasize that decisions must be grounded in ethical responsibility as well as practical feasibility. Leadership, in my view, is the integration of knowledge, principle, and structured action to achieve meaningful, lasting results. As war approached, I advocated for careful preparation, both domestically and internationally. That I stressed that economic stability, diplomatic foresight, and humanitarian planning were essential to prevent unnecessary suffering and maintain social cohesion. That I shared insights on contingency planning, resource allocation, and the importance of disciplined oversight in implementing programs under stress. That I also continued to write and correspond extensively, offering reflections, guidance, and critique to policymakers, scholars, and civic leaders. Through these communications, I reinforced the principles that had guided my life: integrity, disciplined organization, ethical responsibility, and a commitment to practical solutions. That I believe that the lessons of history, combined with careful observation and principled action, could help societies navigate the turbulent path ahead. In these later years, I observe that leadership is a continuous exercise. Even outside formal office, one can shape outcomes, guide decisions, and influence institutions. Experience, principle, and disciplined action are powerful tools that transcend position or title. That I dedicated myself to applying these tools in ways that would maximize positive impact and strengthen both domestic and international structures. That I also considered the moral dimensions of leadership during crisis. Policy is not abstract. It affects real lives. Economic measures, relief efforts, and diplomatic decisions all carry consequences for individuals, families, and communities. That I sought to ensure that guidance was ethically sound, practically feasible, and oriented toward long-term benefit rather than immediate popularity. Throughout this period, I remained acutely aware of the limitations and responsibilities of influence. Advice without execution is empty. Principle without pragmatism is ineffective. That I endeavored to balance ethical clarity with realistic, actionable recommendations, ensuring that my contributions could be implemented successfully and sustainably. As I reflected on these years, I found renewed purpose in consistent service. Even without formal authority, I could make meaningful contributions to the welfare of individuals, the stability of institutions, and the guidance of future leaders. I understood that history measures the effectiveness of service not by visibility, but by tangible outcomes and enduring impact. Ultimately, this period demonstrated the enduring value of experience, principle, and moral responsibility. Through careful advisement, humanitarian engagement, mentorship, and strategic guidance, I was able to influence outcomes, support recovery, and reinforce the importance of disciplined, ethical leadership. These contributions underscored a central belief: meaningful leadership is measured not by position, but by action, integrity, and the lasting benefits delivered to society. The end of the Second World War marked a profound turning point for the world, and for me personally. Though I had long left the office of the presidency, my commitment to public service, humanitarian efforts, and economic guidance did not wane. The post-war era presented both extraordinary challenges and unique opportunities to influence policy, rebuild institutions, and guide a recovering world. That I devoted myself to analyzing the lessons of conflict, particularly the interplay of economic stability, political responsibility, and humanitarian need. Years of experience had taught me that wars, depressions, and societal upheavals are often rooted in systemic failures, mismanagement, or neglect of human welfare. That I sought to advise policymakers, civic leaders, and international organizations on avoiding repetition of past mistakes and on constructing resilient, ethical frameworks for governance. That my work increasingly focused on reconstruction efforts, both domestically and internationally. I emphasized careful planning, disciplined execution, and ethical considerations in allocating resources, managing financial aid, and establishing programs to support the displaced and destitute. That I observed the establishment of international bodies like the United Nations and various economic organizations, providing insights based on decades of experience with international cooperation and humanitarian logistics. That I stressed that effective rebuilding requires not just material resources, but meticulous organization, accountability, and a moral compass guiding every decision. At home, I continued to study and advise on economic stabilization and post-war recovery policies. That I believe that ensuring stability in agriculture, industry, and trade was essential to prevent social unrest and promote long-term prosperity. That I wrote extensively, offering reflections, analyses, and recommendations rooted in historical experience and practical reasoning. My correspondence with economists, politicians, and civic leaders often centered on the principle that economic measures must be guided by both ethics and efficiency. Even as I aged, I remained committed to humanitarian efforts. Millions of people across Europe, Asia, and other regions faced hunger, displacement, and destruction. That I worked with international relief agencies to improve coordination, ensure effective distribution, and respect human dignity. My guiding principle was always the same: aid must restore self-reliance and hope, not create dependency. and every action must be accountable and transparent, that I also spent considerable time mentoring younger leaders, emphasizing lessons drawn from decades of public service that I urged them to value preparation, ethical responsibility, and strategic foresight, and to understand that leadership extends far beyond the exercise of office. Influence, I reminded them, derives from knowledge, integrity, and disciplined application of experience, not from titles or popularity. That I observed that post-war America was entering an era of unprecedented prosperity and global responsibility. Yet prosperity alone does not guarantee stability or moral progress. It requires disciplined governance, ethical leadership, and attention to the welfare of all citizens. That I cautioned against complacency, arguing that societies must remain vigilant in economic planning, civic responsibility, and international cooperation. During these years, I also reflected on the arc of my own life and service, from engineering projects to relief work, from the presidency to decades of post-presidential engagement. I saw a consistent thread: commitment to principle, disciplined organization, and ethical action. That I recognized that my legacy would be evaluated not solely by my time in office, but by the cumulative impact of decades of service and guidance. That my post-war efforts also reinforced my conviction in the moral dimensions of leadership. Policy decisions carry human consequences. Economic programs, relief distribution, and reconstruction planning affect millions of lives. That I remain steadfast in advocating for ethically grounded, practically feasible, and long-term oriented solutions. Leadership, I believed, is a responsibility that endures beyond office, measured by results, integrity, and the welfare of those affected. That I closely monitored global developments, the reconstruction of Europe and Asia, and the establishment of new international economic institutions. That I sought to provide insights on avoiding the pitfalls of the past, encouraging principles of cooperation, accountability, and practical foresight. Experience had shown me that mistakes in policy or planning are rarely forgiven easily, and that the consequences of mismanagement extend far beyond immediate costs. Even as public attention on my presidency faded, my advisory work and humanitarian efforts continued to have tangible impact. That I found renewed purpose in applying decades of experience to help societies recover, rebuild, and establish frameworks for lasting stability. That I believe that true leadership transcends office, manifesting through consistent, principled action and the guidance of others to achieve meaningful outcomes. That I also reflected on the lessons for future leaders navigating complex, interconnected challenges. That I emphasized the need for preparation, ethical clarity, strategic reasoning, and practical execution. Leadership, I reminded them, is about guiding institutions, improving human welfare, and creating structures that endure far beyond one's tenure. This period solidified my understanding that service is lifelong. Even in advanced age, one can contribute to society through counsel, mentorship, humanitarian engagement, and principled action. The measure of a public life is not fame or recognition, but the cumulative positive impact on people, institutions, and society. In sum, the post-war years of my life were dedicated to reflection, guidance, and practical service. That I endeavored to shape economic policy, humanitarian relief, and institutional development in ways that were principled, organized, and effective. That I sought to leave a legacy defined not by position, but by action, integrity, and enduring contributions to human welfare and societal stability. As the world descended into global conflict, I continued to devote myself to service, guidance, and reflection. Though I no longer held formal office, my experience, insight, and ethical grounding allowed me to contribute meaningfully to discussions on policy, humanitarian relief, and economic stabilization. That I understood that the crises of the era required principled, organized, and disciplined action, and I sought to provide it wherever possible. During the early years of the war, I advised on humanitarian programs to aid refugees, displaced populations, and nations devastated by conflict. That I worked closely with relief organizations to ensure that resources were distributed efficiently, ethically, and in ways that preserved dignity and self-reliance. That I emphasized that humanitarian action must be both practical and principled, balancing urgent need with careful planning to maximize impact and minimize waste. That I also engaged with policymakers and scholars, offering counsel on economic recovery, trade policy, and the stabilization of financial systems under extraordinary pressure that I stressed that disciplined oversight, long-term strategy, and cooperative planning were essential to prevent unnecessary suffering and maintain global stability that I drew upon decades of experience. From coordinating post-World War I relief to guiding domestic economic policy to provide actionable, principled recommendations. Throughout this period, I reflected deeply on the lessons of leadership and public service. Crises reveal both strengths and weaknesses, illuminating the ethical and practical dimensions of decision-making that I believe that leadership is measured not by acclaim, position, or popularity, but by the effectiveness, integrity, and enduring impact of one's actions. These reflections guided my advisement, my humanitarian work, and my engagement with the next generation of leaders that I also considered the historical evaluation of my presidency and post-presidential contributions. While public opinion had once been sharply critical, decades of consistent service, ethical engagement, and practical action gradually reshaped perception. Historians and scholars began to recognize that my decisions had been guided by principle, organization, and moral responsibility. Even amid unprecedented economic collapse, that I observed these reassessments with quiet satisfaction, understanding that history often rewards long-term service more than immediate acclaim. Mentorship became an increasingly important focus during these years that I advised diplomats, economists, policymakers, and civic leaders, sharing lessons drawn from a lifetime of experience that I emphasized preparation, ethical responsibility, pragmatic problem-solving, and the need to balance immediate action with long-term vision that I sought to instill the understanding that influence derives not from office or title, but from competence, integrity, and consistent, principled action. That I also reflected on the moral dimensions of policy and leadership in wartime. Decisions about resources, humanitarian relief, and economic planning have profound consequences for human lives. That I advocated that leaders act not only with efficiency, but also with ethical clarity, ensuring that actions serve the broader public good. This principle guided every recommendation, every program, and every engagement during these critical years. My post-presidential activity during the war demonstrated the enduring value of experience and principle. Through careful advisement, humanitarian engagement, and mentorship, I was able to contribute to both domestic and international efforts, supporting stability, recovery, and the welfare of those affected by conflict. I found fulfillment in knowing that decades of experience, applied ethically and methodically, could still make a tangible difference. That I also reflected on the continuity of leadership. Office, title, or political influence are transient. The principles, competence, and ethical grounding of a leader endure far longer. By acting consistently, ethically, and effectively, one can leave an enduring legacy that transcends the limitations of position or circumstance. That I sought to demonstrate this truth through every engagement, from advisory work to humanitarian coordination. During these years, I increasingly considered the broader meaning of legacy. That a life devoted to service is measured by the cumulative impact of one's actions. The institution strengthened, the crises mitigated, and the lives improved. That I understood that even failures carry lessons for future leaders, and that experience, applied ethically, can transform challenges into guidance for generations to come. That I also reflected on resilience, the capacity to endure criticism, adversity, and setbacks while continuing to serve. The presidency, the Great Depression, and global upheaval had tested me in every way imaginable. Yet I found purpose in continued engagement, knowing that principled, disciplined action is the true measure of leadership. That I sought to embody this principle in every advisory role, every humanitarian initiative, and every lesson imparted to others. As the war progressed, I continued to emphasize structured planning, accountability, and ethical responsibility. From economic policy to humanitarian relief, I stressed that effective leadership requires careful analysis, practical execution, and moral clarity. That I reminded those I advised that history rewards foresight, integrity, and disciplined action far more than temporary recognition or popularity. That I also continued to reflect on the lessons of the past, both my own and those of the world at large. Economic collapse, political extremism, and humanitarian crises underscored the importance of preparation, ethical leadership, and international cooperation. I believe that applying these lessons thoughtfully could prevent unnecessary suffering, strengthen institutions, and promote stability in an uncertain world. Throughout these years, I observed the slow evolution of public and historical perception. My presidency, once criticized sharply, was increasingly understood in context, and my post-presidential service highlighted a broader narrative, one of dedication, ethical commitment, and practical action. I found reassurance in knowing that history evaluates the full arc of a life, not only the immediate outcomes of office. Ultimately, these final decades demonstrated that service, principle, and consistent action define a lasting legacy. I continued to contribute where experience and insight were needed, mentor future leaders, and apply the lessons of a lifetime to the pressing problems of the time. I understood that true leadership is measured by tangible impact, ethical integrity, and the enduring benefits delivered to society. As I looked back on my life, I saw a thread running through every chapter, a commitment to organized, principled, and effective service, from engineering projects to humanitarian relief, from the presidency to advisory and mentoring roles. The guiding principles remained the same: integrity, discipline, ethical responsibility, and dedication to the public good. I hoped that this example would serve as guidance for generations of leaders to come. Even in my final years, I found purpose in continuing to apply experience, counsel, and ethical judgment. Service, I realized, is lifelong. Influence persists beyond office, and principled, disciplined action has the power to shape institutions, mitigate crises, and improve lives across time and place. I understood that the measure of a life in public service is not immediate recognition, but the cumulative impact of principled action, disciplined organization, and ethical commitment. I found satisfaction in knowing that, even decades after leaving office, my contributions continued to support stability, guide leaders, and relieve human suffering. This, I believed, was the true legacy of a life devoted to public service. In the years following the Second World War, I dedicated myself more intensely to humanitarian and international service. Though my presidency had long ended, the moral imperative to apply experience, knowledge, and principle to global challenges remained undiminished. The destruction left by war required not only physical rebuilding, but ethical guidance, organizational acumen, and practical oversight. I worked closely with international relief organizations, observing and advising on programs aimed at feeding, housing, and rehabilitating millions of people across Europe and Asia. The sheer scale of need was staggering, but it reinforced my lifelong conviction: humanitarian action must be methodical, principled, and focused on long-term self-reliance rather than mere temporary relief. I emphasized that aid should restore dignity, encourage initiative, and promote sustainable recovery. The establishment of the United Nations and other post-war institutions provided both hope and opportunity. I sought to offer counsel on how these organizations could function efficiently, transparently, and ethically. Drawing upon my experience coordinating international relief after the First World War, I advocated for rigorous planning, accountability, and the consistent application of principle in decision-making. I believe that without discipline and ethical clarity, even the best-intentioned institutions risked inefficiency, corruption, or failure to meet human needs. I also advised on post-war economic policy. Rebuilding devastated nations required not only material resources, but sound economic planning. I urged governments to focus on fiscal responsibility, agricultural stabilization, and trade coordination to prevent renewed crises. My council stressed that economic recovery must be practical, ethical, and forward-looking, addressing both immediate necessity and long-term sustainability. Mentorship remained a central focus of my work. I corresponded with diplomats, economists, and political leaders, sharing lessons drawn from decades of public service. I stressed that leadership is not defined by title, but by competence, integrity, and consistent action. Preparation, ethical judgment, and disciplined execution were the principles I hoped to instill in those who would guide future generations. I reflected often on the moral dimensions of leadership during these years. Policy decisions, economic programs, and humanitarian strategies carry profound consequences for real people. I emphasized that efficiency must be matched with ethical responsibility. Expedience alone cannot justify actions that compromise human dignity. that I consistently reminded those I advised that principled action is the enduring measure of leadership, that my post-war activities also offered opportunities to evaluate the cumulative lessons of a lifetime. From engineering projects to humanitarian relief, from the presidency to decades of advisory service, I observed patterns and principles that endure. Discipline, ethical commitment, preparation, and the practical application of knowledge that I sought to codify these lessons for the benefit of future leaders and the institutions they would guide. Even as public recognition of my work waned, my sense of duty remained unwavering that I understood that history often appreciates contributions in hindsight, and that the true measure of a life in service is the cumulative impact of action, not the immediacy of praised. My late-life work demonstrated that consistent, principled, and methodical engagement can shape institutions, mitigate crises, and improve human welfare, that I also reflected on resilience, both personal and institutional. The trials of the Great Depression, my presidency, and the Second World War had tested every aspect of leadership, governance, and moral judgment. Yet I found purpose and fulfillment in continued engagement, knowing that disciplined, principled action has enduring impact. During these years, I observed the evolving post-war international order that I provided advice on coordinating relief efforts, stabilizing economies, and fostering global cooperation. Experience had taught me that international crises can be mitigated, but only if leadership is informed, principled, and grounded in practical understanding. That I often wrote, spoke, and corresponded on the importance of long-term vision and governance. That short-term expedients may solve immediate problems, but without planning, foresight, and ethical grounding, the consequences often outweigh the benefits. That I emphasize that leaders must consider both practical outcomes and moral implications of every decision. My guidance extended beyond policy and governance. That I encouraged younger leaders to cultivate character, discipline, and a sense of responsibility that transcends office. Leadership, I reminded them, is a lifelong endeavor, measured by the enduring benefits one leaves to society, not temporary acclaim or position. Humanitarian work remained central to my post-war years. That I oversaw relief initiatives, promoted ethical distribution of resources, and sought to maximize the impact of every program. That I stressed transparency, accountability, and respect for those served, reinforcing the principle that aid should empower rather than create dependency. That I also reflected on history and the perception of leadership. The judgments of contemporaries often differ from those of historians. Immediate criticism can obscure long-term contributions. That I took comfort in the knowledge that principled action, sustained service, and ethical commitment ultimately shape enduring legacies. Even in the final decades of my life, I found meaning in active engagement. Through advisory roles, mentorship, and humanitarian coordination, I continued to influence policy, aid recovery, and shape leadership culture. That I believe that true service is measured not by office or title, but by tangible, principled impact on human lives and institutions. That I remained committed to teaching lessons drawn from history. Preparation prevents unnecessary suffering. Ethical clarity guides responsible decisions. Discipline ensures effective execution. Long-term vision safeguards society against repeated mistakes. I also emphasize the interconnection of policy, human welfare, and governance. Economic stabilization, social welfare programs, and international coordination are not abstract. They are essential to the well-being of millions. My council always integrated practical action with ethical responsibility. Ultimately, these post-war years reinforced a lifelong conviction. Leadership and service are enduring responsibilities. They demand preparation, ethical judgment, practical execution, and unwavering commitment to human welfare. Even after decades of experience, consistently applied, can continue to make a meaningful difference. Through my late-life work, I sought to demonstrate that a principled, disciplined, and morally grounded approach to leadership can shape institutions, guide decision-makers, and improve the lives of countless individuals. Legacy is not determined by position alone, but by the cumulative, ethical, and effective contributions a life of service produces. Entering the final chapter of my life, I found myself reflecting not only on the past, but on the future of the nation I had served. America, having endured wars, economic depressions, and social transformations, stood at a crossroads of opportunity and responsibility. Even as an elder statesman, I felt compelled to offer guidance and share the lessons learned from decades of observation, governance, and humanitarian service that I devoted much time to studying the evolving social and economic landscape of post-war America. The nation had experienced remarkable growth, but prosperity alone does not guarantee stability or moral progress. That I urge policymakers and civic leaders to remember that economic expansion must be paired with disciplined management, ethical responsibility, and long-term planning. That I often reflected on the role of government in society. Its purpose, I believed, is to provide structure, stability, and protection while fostering individual initiative and responsibility. Government must act as a guide and enabler, not a substitute for personal effort. That I cautioned against excessive intervention that might undermine the character and self-reliance of citizens. Education and opportunity were also central to my reflections. That a nation's strength rests upon the skills, knowledge, and moral character of its people. That I emphasized that public investment in education, infrastructure, and civic institutions is essential to long-term prosperity. These foundations, I believed, ensure not only economic growth, but the ethical cultivation of future generations. That I observed that the lessons of the Great Depression and two world wars remain relevant. Economic policies must be forward-looking, grounded in sound principles, and guided by ethical considerations. Crisis preparedness, fiscal responsibility, and prudent regulation are necessary to prevent repeat disasters and to sustain national stability. That I, in my reflections, I often considered the interplay between private enterprise and public governance. Business innovation drives progress, but it requires an ethical framework and oversight to prevent abuses. That I advocated for balance, the ingenuity and initiative of private enterprise, tempered by prudent regulation, transparency, and accountability. That I also devoted considerable thought to the moral responsibilities of leadership. Leaders at every level, whether in government, business, or civic organizations, bear a duty to act with integrity, foresight, and discipline. Short-term popularity cannot substitute for long-term principle, and decisions must be measured by their lasting consequences for society. Even in retirement, I continued to write extensively, offer counsel, and speak on public policy. My goal was to provide practical guidance, grounded in decades of experience, to help leaders avoid mistakes, promote efficiency, and enhance human welfare. That I sought to demonstrate that effective leadership requires both ethical clarity and disciplined execution. That I also reflected on the importance of social cohesion. That a nation may prosper materially, but without shared values, mutual responsibility, and respect for institutions, it risks instability. That I emphasized civic engagement, community responsibility, and ethical citizenship as essential to a healthy society. Throughout this period, I maintained correspondence with economists, politicians, and civic leaders. That I shared insights on sustainable growth, crisis prevention, and the ethical application of public policy. Experience had taught me that knowledge alone is insufficient. The disciplined, principled application of knowledge is what shapes enduring outcomes. That I considered the challenges of future generations. They would inherit an increasingly complex world, interconnected economies, and moral dilemmas that require both wisdom and practical judgment. That I urged them to cultivate foresight, embrace responsibility, and understand that leadership is a lifelong commitment to public service and human welfare. That I also reflected on the role of historical memory. The successes and failures of past leaders offer invaluable lessons, provided society studies them critically and applies their insights. That I hoped my own experiences, both achievements and setbacks, might serve as guidance for those navigating the difficult paths of governance and public service. Even in these final decades, I found purpose in contributing to debates on economic policy, humanitarian efforts, and institutional development. I believe that a life of service extends beyond formal office and that wisdom, experience, and ethical commitment remain valuable at any age. Ultimately, this first segment of my final chapter is a meditation on stewardship, responsibility, and foresight. That a nation's prosperity is not guaranteed by wealth alone. It requires careful planning, ethical leadership, and active participation by all citizens. That I endeavored to share these insights, believing that the lessons of the past can illuminate the path forward and help secure a stable, prosperous, and just future for America. As I entered the final decades of my life, I found myself reflecting more deeply on the arc of history, the lessons of leadership, and the nature of service. Years of public service, from engineering projects to humanitarian work and the presidency, had provided a unique vantage point on human endeavor, governance, and the consequences of action, or inaction, that I often considered how societies respond to crises. Economic depressions, wars, and political upheavals test the resilience of institutions. The integrity of leadership and the character of the people that I observed that mismanagement, lack of preparation, or ethical compromise often magnifies suffering and undermines recovery. It was my conviction that leadership rooted in principle, discipline, and moral clarity can mitigate such crises and guide society toward stability. Even in my later years, I remained engaged in policy discussions and humanitarian initiatives that I offered counsel to governments, international organizations, and civic leaders on sustainable development, economic stabilization, and relief efforts. That my aim was always practical, to provide actionable guidance, grounded in decades of experience, that could prevent mistakes and enhance outcomes. That I reflected on the enduring importance of preparation. Preparation is not merely logistical. It is intellectual, ethical, and moral. That a well-prepared leader anticipates challenges, understands the consequences of decisions, and ensures that principles guide every action. I stressed to younger generations that preparation is a safeguard for both human welfare and institutional integrity. The lessons of leadership, I observed, are timeless. Effective governance requires a combination of foresight, ethical judgment, and disciplined execution. Popularity, convenience, or political expedience are insufficient metrics for success. Enduring leadership is measured by tangible outcomes and the welfare of those served. That I also contemplated the responsibilities of historical legacy. History evaluates leaders with the benefit of hindsight, often highlighting overlooked successes or misjudged failures. That I found solace in knowing that principled, sustained service leaves lasting impact, even if recognition comes slowly or selectively. Legacy, I believed, is less about accolades and more about the measurable difference made in the lives of people, institutions, and society. During these years, I devoted energy to mentoring and correspondence. That I shared lessons on crisis management, ethical leadership, and the practicalities of public service. That I encourage future leaders to embrace responsibility, act with integrity, and maintain the discipline necessary to see initiatives through to meaningful conclusion. Humanitarian work remains central to my endeavors. That I continue to monitor global relief programs, advise on efficient allocation of resources, and promote practices that respected human dignity. That I emphasize that aid must empower, restore hope, and build sustainable recovery rather than creating dependency. That I also reflected on the interconnectedness of domestic and international policy. Economic stability, social welfare, and institutional resilience are inseparable from global trends and cooperation. Leaders must understand this interdependence, applying principles of ethical governance, foresight, and disciplined execution to achieve positive, enduring results. In these final decades, I increasingly focused on codifying the principles that had guided my life. Integrity in action, even when unpopular; preparation and foresight as instruments of stability; ethical responsibility as the foundation of decision-making; disciplined execution to ensure plans translate into effective outcomes. I believe that these principles are universally applicable, regardless of era, nation, or office. They are the essence of leadership that serves rather than dominates, guides rather than controls, and builds rather than destroys. That I also reflected on the moral dimensions of public service. Decisions carry consequences for countless lives. Therefore, ethical clarity is indispensable. That I reminded those I advised that power without principle leads to instability, suffering, and the erosion of trust. That I looked back on my own presidency, the Great Depression, and the subsequent decades of advisory and humanitarian work. I recognized a central truth. The value of a life in service is measured by consistent, principled, and effective action. Recognition, fame, or popularity are secondary to the real, lasting impact on human welfare and institutional strength. That I also contemplated the interplay of experience and judgment. Years of engagement provide insights unavailable to those untested by adversity. The ability to anticipate consequences, to guide action ethically, and to maintain discipline under pressure is cultivated over a lifetime and applied for the benefit of others. In my reflections, I considered the future of leadership. I urged emerging leaders to embrace preparation, ethical judgment, and strategic thinking, and to recognize that the true measure of service is enduring impact rather than immediate recognition. Leadership, I reminded them, extends beyond office and is defined by the quality of guidance and the welfare achieved. Even as public attention faded, I continued to write, advise, and mentor. These activities were not for personal acclaim, but for the betterment of institutions, policies, and human lives. The satisfaction of service lies in its effects, not in applause or titles. I also reflected on resilience. Both personal and collective, societies face repeated challenges, yet disciplined, ethical, and prepared leadership can prevent catastrophe and promote recovery. Similarly, an individual's lifelong commitment to principle and action can leave a tangible, positive mark on the world. In the closing chapters of life, I sought to leave a framework of guidance for future generations. A framework rooted in ethics, discipline, preparation, and practical execution, one that integrates moral responsibility with tangible outcomes. This, I believed, is the essence of enduring leadership and meaningful public service. Finally, I reflected on the sum of my own experiences: engineering projects, humanitarian relief, the presidency, and decades of advisory work. A consistent thread ran through it all: commitment to principle, disciplined action, ethical responsibility, and the pursuit of practical solutions that improve human welfare. I hoped that this legacy would guide future leaders in navigating crises, rebuilding societies, and creating institutions that endure. In conclusion, the final years of my life were devoted to reflection, guidance, and action. I remain convinced that true leadership is ethical, disciplined, and practical, that service is a lifelong commitment, and that legacy is measured by enduring impact rather than temporary recognition. Through decades of experience applied with principle, it is possible to shape institutions, guide policy, and improve countless lives. This, I believed, is the measure of a life devoted to service. In these later years, my attention increasingly turned to the world beyond our borders. America's prosperity and stability, I believed, were intimately linked to the broader international order. Global trade, diplomacy, and humanitarian responsibility were inseparable from national well-being. I often reflected that no nation can thrive in isolation. Economic, political, and moral interdependence is both inevitable and essential. I maintained a keen interest in international economic policy. The lessons of the Great Depression were indelibly imprinted upon me. Unchecked speculation, lack of foresight, and disregard for ethical responsibility can bring ruin far beyond the borders of a single nation. I advocated for policies that balanced growth with prudence, initiative with regulation, and ambition with moral consideration. Humanitarian work remained central to my purpose. The suffering I had witnessed during and after the World Wars reinforced my belief that aid must be principled, organized, and sustained. I advised relief organizations, governments, and civic institutions on best practices, emphasizing that true assistance empowers communities rather than creating dependency. Respecting human dignity, fostering self-reliance, and planning for long-term recovery were my consistent priorities. I also reflected on the lessons of diplomacy. Negotiation, collaboration, and mutual understanding are the pillars of peaceful international relations. Yet, ethical considerations must guide decisions. Power and expedience alone cannot sustain lasting peace. I urged leaders to combine strategic thinking with moral clarity, recognizing that true security is rooted in both justice and prudence. Education and civic engagement, I observed, are not solely domestic concerns. A well-informed global citizenry is essential for the stability of international relations and economic cooperation. I promoted the idea that knowledge, ethical judgment, and civic responsibility must extend beyond national borders, creating leaders capable of addressing challenges on a global scale. I often reflected on the fragility of peace and prosperity. Economic crises, political instability, and social unrest in one region can ripple worldwide. I encouraged leaders to anticipate consequences, adopt preventive measures, and maintain disciplined, ethical governance. History had taught me that short-term expediency can jeopardize long-term stability, and that principled leadership is the most reliable. Safeguard.my correspondence and consultations extended to foreign policymakers, economists, and humanitarian leaders that I shared lessons from America's experiences, advocating policies that harmonize national interests with global responsibility. Experience had convinced me that leadership, whether national or international, requires foresight, ethics, and disciplined execution. That I also pondered the role of institutions in global governance. Effective international organizations require accountability, transparency, and principled administration. Without these foundations, even well-intentioned initiatives can falter, leaving populations underserved and crises unresolved. That I sought to guide institutions towards sustainable effectiveness, emphasizing planning, ethical standards, and practical implementation. In reflecting on humanity's progress, I recognize the importance of moral leadership. We are bound by responsibilities not only to our citizens, but to all who may be affected by our actions. Economic aid, diplomacy, and policy must consider consequences for human life, dignity, and long-term stability. That I also examine the interplay between domestic and global priorities. That a nation cannot thrive if it ignores global instability, nor can it disregard domestic welfare in pursuing international ambitions. That I advised leaders to balance these priorities with prudence, ethical clarity, and long-term perspective. Even in my advanced years, I continued to write, advise, and mentor. My hope was that the application of experience, combined with ethical principle, could help future leaders navigate crises, foster international cooperation, and advance human welfare. Leadership, I believed, is measured by the ability to combine practical action with moral responsibility, both domestically and abroad. Finally, I reflected on the enduring responsibilities of citizenship. Every citizen contributes to the moral and practical strength of a nation, just as every nation contributes to the stability of the world. That I emphasize that ethical judgment, disciplined action, and long-term vision are as important in public service as in private life, and that these principles extend to global engagement. In summary, this second segment of my final chapter is a meditation on America's role in the world. Prosperity, stability, and peace require ethical leadership, disciplined governance, and international cooperation. Through decades of observation and service, I sought to impart these lessons, believing that principled guidance, sustained action, and moral clarity are essential to both national and global well-being. As I entered the final years of my life, I devoted much thought to the enduring principles of governance and leadership. That I reflected on the lessons of my own presidency, the experiences of public service, and the evolving challenges facing both the nation and the world. That it became increasingly clear to me that the measure of leadership is not temporary acclaim or popularity, but lasting impact on the welfare of people and the stability of institutions. That I often considered the moral responsibilities inherent in public office. Decisions made by leaders carry consequences for countless lives. Ethical clarity and disciplined judgment are indispensable. That a leader must resist the temptation of expediency, placing principle above personal gain or fleeting approval. That I sought to convey to future generations that integrity, foresight, and consistency in action are the foundation of enduring governance. Public service, I believed, is a lifelong commitment. Even after leaving formal office, one's responsibility to advise, guide, and contribute does not cease. Through writing, correspondence, and counsel, I endeavored to share practical lessons grounded in experience, emphasizing both the moral and operational dimensions of leadership. That I reflected on the importance of preparedness. Whether confronting economic crises, social upheaval, or international conflicts, careful planning, disciplined execution, and ethical grounding are essential. That I emphasize that preparation is not merely administrative, but also intellectual and moral. It is a safeguard for human welfare and institutional resilience. That I also considered the balance between domestic priorities and international obligations. That a strong nation cannot ignore global responsibilities, nor can it neglect domestic stability while pursuing international ambitions. That I urged leaders to integrate foresight, ethical judgment, and disciplined action across all domains of governance. Education and civic responsibility remain central to my reflections. That a nation's longevity and prosperity depend upon an informed, engaged, and morally conscious citizenry that I encouraged investment in education, infrastructure, and civic institutions, believing that these foundations foster both economic growth and ethical leadership, that I often pondered the lessons of history. The successes and failures of leaders provide invaluable insights, provided society studies them critically and applies the lessons that I hope that my own experiences, both accomplishments and setbacks, might serve as a guide for those navigating the complexities of governance, policy, and human welfare. Even in my later years, I remained active in humanitarian and civic endeavors that I advised relief organizations, international institutions, and governments, striving to improve the efficiency, fairness, and impact of programs designed to alleviate suffering and promote sustainable development. That I reflected on the interdependence of ethics and action. Good intentions alone are insufficient. Outcomes require disciplined execution, careful planning, and ethical oversight. That I emphasize that leaders must translate principle into practice, ensuring that decisions have tangible, positive effects on society. As I contemplated the future, I felt a deep responsibility to impart lessons on leadership. I urged future leaders to embrace principle, foresight, and discipline, to understand that service is both privilege and duty, and that enduring impact outweighs short-term recognition. That I also reflected on the role of legacy. History judges not by the words spoken or promises made, but by the tangible difference created in the lives of people and the strength of institutions left behind. That I sought to leave a record that demonstrates the importance of ethical, disciplined, and principled leadership. Throughout these years, I consistently emphasized the need for courage, humility, and persistence. Leadership requires the willingness to act decisively in the face of uncertainty, to acknowledge errors, and to adapt while remaining anchored to principle. That I encouraged future generations to develop both moral fortitude and practical wisdom, recognizing that effective governance balances ideals with results. That in my reflections, I also considered the responsibilities of citizens. A thriving democracy relies on engaged, informed, and ethically conscious individuals. Leadership alone cannot ensure prosperity or justice. It must be supported by citizens committed to the collective good. Finally, I contemplated the enduring purpose of a life devoted to service. That it is not measured by fame or accolades, but by the improvements made in human welfare, the stability of institutions, and the guidance provided to those who follow. That I hoped that my experiences, reflections, and writings would serve as a compass for future leaders, emphasizing that principled, disciplined, and ethical action is the cornerstone of lasting impact. In conclusion, this final segment of my life's reflections underscores the lessons I wish to impart. Leadership is service. Service demands integrity, discipline, and foresight, and legacy is determined by tangible, lasting contributions to the welfare of humanity and the stability of society. Through decades of action, observation, and counsel, I sought to demonstrate that a life devoted to service can shape institutions, guide policy, and leave a meaningful imprint on the world. As the final years of my life unfolded, reflection became not only a habit, but a solemn responsibility. That I often found myself contemplating the arc of history, the trajectory of the United States, and the legacy that each generation leaves for the next. My own experiences, spanning public service, humanitarian work, and the trials of leadership, served as a lens through which I examined the enduring principles of governance, responsibility, and human welfare. That I frequently considered the moral dimension of leadership. True leaders, I believed, must balance ambition with principle, decisiveness with ethical restraint, and vision with disciplined execution. Leadership is measured not by personal acclaim or temporary success, but by the lasting welfare of the people and the strength of the institutions entrusted to one's care. That I often reflected on my presidency, aware of both the criticism and the praise it generated, and sought to distill the lessons that might benefit future public servants. Public service, in my view, is a lifelong commitment. Even after leaving office, one remains accountable for providing guidance, sharing knowledge, and contributing to the common good. That I devoted considerable energy to writing, advising, and mentoring those engaged in governance, emphasizing that the effective application of knowledge requires both discipline and ethical clarity. That I spent much time pondering the evolution of American society, the shifts I witnessed, from rural communities to Urban centers, from industrial expansion to technological advancement, revealed both progress and new challenges that I examined how these changes influenced civic participation, public trust, and the capacity of citizens to uphold democratic ideals that I urged that education, civic responsibility, and ethical awareness are essential foundations for a resilient, prosperous society. International affairs remained a constant concern. The world had grown smaller, yet more interconnected and complex than I believed. America's security, prosperity, and moral influence are intertwined with global developments that I advocated for policies that balance national self-interest with international cooperation, guided by foresight, principle, and disciplined execution. Economic crises, conflicts, and humanitarian emergencies abroad provided lessons for domestic governance and reinforced the necessity of ethical, informed decision-making. Education and civic engagement were central themes in my reflections. The long-term stability of a society depends on informed citizens capable of critical thinking and ethical judgment that I encouraged investment in schools, infrastructure, and public institutions, not merely as instruments of economic growth, but as pillars of civic virtue and moral responsibility. Cultivating a culture of learning and engagement ensures that successive generations are prepared to confront both foreseeable and unforeseen challenges. That I also examine the role of historical memory and the study of past leadership. The successes and failures of previous leaders offer indispensable guidance, provided that we study them critically and learn from them. That I hoped my own experiences, both achievements and errors, might serve as reference points, illustrating the consequences of choices and the value of principled action. Ethical leadership, I believed, is the cornerstone of lasting influence. That short-term popularity, political maneuvering, or expedient compromises may offer temporary gains, but only principled, disciplined leadership leaves enduring benefits for society. That I emphasize that leaders must convert principles into practical, effective action, ensuring that their decisions tangibly improve the welfare of the people and the resilience of institutions. That I reflected deeply on the interplay between domestic and international priorities. That a strong, stable nation requires careful attention to both internal governance and global engagement. Domestic prosperity cannot be sustained in isolation, nor can international ambition be pursued without regard for internal stability. That I urged leaders to cultivate a holistic perspective, combining strategic foresight, ethical judgment, and disciplined implementation. Personal resilience and adaptability remained essential themes. Leadership and service demand not only intelligence and ethical clarity, but also humility, stamina, and a willingness to learn from mistakes. The measure of one's life lies not in avoiding errors, but in responding to them with integrity, courage, and persistence. That I also contemplated the nature of legacy. Legacy is not measured by honors, public recognition, or fame. That it is found in the systems built, the guidance provided, and the enduring improvement of human welfare. That I hoped that my writings, reflections, and counsel would serve as a guide for future generations, demonstrating that ethical, disciplined, and principled action can shape both society and history. Even in quiet retirement, I remained attentive to societal and global challenges. That I observed policies, social developments, and international events with careful analysis, offering insights to strengthen institutions, mitigate crises, and cultivate ethical leadership. Finally, I reflected on the responsibilities of citizens. That a democracy thrives not merely because of leaders, but because citizens engage, deliberate, and act responsibly. Leadership provides guidance, but the enduring health of a society depends on an informed, ethically conscious populace willing to sustain collective welfare. In conclusion, the final chapter of my reflections emphasizes the ultimate lessons I wish to impart. Leadership is service. Service demands integrity, discipline, and moral clarity. And legacy is measured by tangible improvements in human welfare and institutional resilience. Through decades of public service, humanitarian engagement, and reflection, I endeavored to demonstrate that principled, disciplined, and ethical action can guide humanity toward stability, justice, and lasting prosperity. As I advanced further into the twilight of my life, reflection became not merely an exercise, but a daily companion. That I thought extensively about the nation I had served, the lessons gleaned from triumphs and failures, and the broader currents of history that shaped the world around me. Even in retirement, I remained keenly aware that my experiences, my successes, and missteps might offer guidance to those navigating the uncertain waters of governance, policy, and civic responsibility. That I often pondered the nature of leadership itself, that a leader's duty is not merely to occupy office, to exercise power, or to command obedience. True leadership entails understanding the moral, social, and practical consequences of every action. That it requires foresight, patience, and an unwavering commitment to principle. That I reflected on my own presidency, the decisions I made under pressure, and the moments when expediency tempted me to compromise my judgment. That I sought to distill these experiences into enduring lessons for future generations. During these years, I spent considerable time writing, advising, and engaging with scholars, civic leaders, and public servants. That I shared insights on economic policy, institutional resilience, and ethical governance. That I emphasized that knowledge alone is insufficient. The disciplined, principled application of knowledge is what creates tangible, lasting outcomes. That I encouraged emerging leaders to combine intellect with moral clarity, initiative with restraint, and vision with careful execution. That I also reflected extensively on the evolution of American society. From the rural communities of my youth to the sprawling urban landscapes of my later years, I observed profound changes, technological advances, social mobility, and shifting political ideologies. That I considered how these changes affected civic engagement, public trust, and the capacity of citizens to participate meaningfully in democracy. That I stressed that a healthy society relies not solely on government or institutions, but on the informed, ethically conscious participation of its people. International affairs continued to command my attention. The world had grown smaller, yet simultaneously more complex and interconnected. That I believed America's prosperity and security are intertwined with the global community. Our decisions reverberate far beyond our borders. I advocated for balanced foreign policies, policies that respect national sovereignty, foster international cooperation, and uphold ethical principles. That I reflected on the lessons of economic crises, conflicts, and humanitarian challenges abroad, believing they offer valuable guidance for domestic and international governance alike. Education and civic responsibility remained recurring themes in my reflections. That a society's endurance and prosperity depend on the cultivation of knowledge, critical thinking, and ethical awareness among its citizens. That I urged leaders and institutions to invest in education, public service, and infrastructure, not merely as economic tools, but as foundations of moral and civic strength. That I believe that fostering a culture of learning and responsibility ensures that each generation is equipped to face both predictable challenges and unforeseen crises. That I also considered the role of public memory and history, the lessons of past leaders, the successes and failures recorded in our national story, provide a vital compass for future governance. That I hoped my own experiences, though imperfect, might serve as a point of reference for those tasked with guiding the nation forward. History, I reminded myself, is both teacher and judge. It rewards integrity, foresight, and disciplined action, while exposing short-sightedness, arrogance, and neglect. That in these years, I continued to emphasize the importance of ethical leadership. Whether in government, business, or civic life, the combination of principle, prudence, and disciplined action forms the cornerstone of enduring influence. That I cautioned that short-term popularity or partisan gain is fleeting. Only principled leadership leaves a lasting, constructive legacy. That I devoted considerable attention to the interplay between domestic policy and global responsibility. That America's internal stability, economic vitality, and social cohesion are inseparable from its conduct abroad. That I advocated policies that balance national self-interest with international cooperation, grounded in foresight, ethics, and practical execution. Reflecting on the arc of my life, I often contemplated personal resilience. Leadership, service, and engagement with the world demand not only intelligence and principle, but stamina, humility, and adaptability. Mistakes are inevitable. The true measure lies in learning, adjusting, and persisting with integrity and purpose. That I also thought deeply about the nature of legacy. Legacy is not found in titles, honors, or public recognition. That it is found in the structures we build, the guidance we provide, and the lasting improvements made to the welfare of people and the strength of institutions. That I hope that my writings, reflections, and counsel would serve as a guide for generations to come, emphasizing disciplined, principled, and ethical action. Even in the quiet of retirement, I remained engaged with pressing issues that I observed: economic policy, social development, and global events with the same analytical rigor that guided my early career. That I offered insights on how to prevent recurring crises, strengthen institutions, and cultivate ethical leadership across all sectors of society. That I also reflected on the responsibilities of citizens. A thriving democracy depends on informed, ethically conscious participation. Leaders can guide, but citizens sustain. Their awareness, responsibility, and engagement determine whether principles of justice, fairness, and human welfare endure. That I in conclusion. This chapter is a meditation on the enduring responsibilities of leadership, service, and citizenship that I have sought to impart. The lessons learned from decades of public service, humanitarian work, and observation of history. Leadership is measured not by fleeting applause, but by the lasting positive impact on society, the ethical foundations laid for future generations, and the resilience of institutions. Through reflection, counsel, and continued engagement, I endeavored to leave a record demonstrating that principled, disciplined, and morally conscious service can shape the world and guide humanity toward stability, justice, and prosperity.